Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I'd always been drawn to the outdoors since childhood, finding peace among trees that city life never provided. My buddy Jack shared this passion. We'd been friends since elementary school in Toronto, back when we'd skip class to explore the ravines near our neighborhood. Over the years, those youthful adventures evolved into a sacred ritual. Every summer, we'd select a remote location, pack minimally, and disappear into nature for a weekend. As time passed, our expeditions required increasing challenges to deliver that same rush of excitement. We invented what we called hardcore camping, though surely others had coined similar terms before us. Our version meant no tents or cooking equipment, just ponchos, ground sheets, and whatever essentials we could carry on our backs. Food supplies were deliberately limited. After the initial days, we'd need to forage, fish, and live off the land if we wanted to eat. The difficulty was precisely what made it worthwhile. In the summer of 2022, when we were both 28, Jack and I selected Algonquin Provincial Park as our destination, a vast expanse of forests and lakes in Ontario, planning for 7 full days of wilderness immersion. The park sprawled across thousands of acres, offering some of the most isolated terrain in the province, perfect for what we had in mind. "This time we're really doing it," Jack said as we packed our gear in my apartment the night before departure. "No bailouts, no shortcuts." I nodded, mentally reviewing our minimal supply list. 7 days, just us and whatever the forest provides. Jack grinned, his tall frame hunched over his backpack as he methodically arranged his items. "Remember Killarney last year, when you wanted to head back early because of those mosquitoes?" "They were the size of hummingbirds," I protested, though I knew he was right. I'd nearly given up after 3 days of endless bites and sleepless nights. "This time will be different." "It better be," Jack said, zipping his pack with finality. "I've been waiting all year for this." That evening, we reviewed our topographical maps plotting a route that would take us deep into Algonquin's interior, far from marked trails and established campsites. Our plan was aggressive, covering significant distance each day to reach areas rarely visited by casual hikers. Sleep came fitfully that night, not from fear, but anticipation. The wilderness called to us in a way that was difficult to explain to others. Most of our friends preferred their vacations with amenities and comfort. They couldn't comprehend the appeal of voluntary hardship. But Jack and I understood what drove us into those remote places. The raw authenticity of survival, the connection to something primal and real. Morning arrived and we loaded my aging Honda with our minimal gear. The 3-hour drive north passed with excited conversation about previous trips and expectations for this one. Jack fiddled with the radio, finally settling on classic rock that accompanied us through the increasingly rural landscape. By early afternoon, we reached the western access point of Algonquin Park. We parked near a small ranger station, signed the trail register with our expected return date, and shouldered our packs. The wait felt good, familiar, and purposeful. "Ready?" Jack asked, adjusting his shoulder straps. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the pine-scented air. Born ready. With that, we stepped onto the trail and began our journey into the wilderness. The first day unfolded exactly as planned. We hiked 12 miles from the trailhead, cutting through dense stands of pine and birch. The air hung cool around us, the sky patched with clouds that offered occasional relief from the sun. Jack set a brisk pace, his long legs carrying him, effortlessly over fallen logs and across streams, while I maintained a steady rhythm behind him. As evening approached, we established camp near a shallow creek. I rigged my poncho between trees while Jack gathered wood for a small fire. We ate jerky, boiled creek water and watched flames diminish as stars emerged overhead. The forests, quiet enveloped us, just leaf rustling and distant owl calls. This simplicity was exactly what we sought. No artificial noise, no crowds, just us embedded in wilderness. First day down, Jack remarked, poking at the dying embers with a stick. "How are your feet holding up?" I rotated my ankles, feeling the day's exertion. "They'll be screaming tomorrow, but nothing I can't handle." "Good," he nodded, "because tomorrow gets harder." He wasn't wrong. Day 2 brought challenging terrain, a landscape of exposed roots and jagged rocks, with a steep ridge requiring careful navigation. By midday, my calves burned with exertion, and Jack's height advantage allowed him to consistently outpace me. "Hold up," I called as he disappeared around a bend for the 3rd time that hour. "Some of us don't have giraffe legs." Jack backtracked, his expression apologetic but excited. "Sorry, man. Just feeling good out here." I took a moment to catch my breath, drinking from my canteen. "We've got 5 more days. Pace yourself." That night, we slept on a flat stretch of moss. The ground radiated cold through my thin ground sheet, and I woke once to the sound of snapping twigs, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife beside me. In the moonlight, I caught glimpse of a deer threading through trees before disappearing into darkness. By the 3rd day, our bodies had adjusted to the rhythm of backcountry travel. Our packs lightened as food supplies dwindled, but hunger served as motivation rather than deterrent. That afternoon, Jack demonstrated his outdoor prowess by catching a small trout using improvised fishing gear, a length of paracord, and a hook he'd brought specifically for this purpose. We cooked the fish over a careful fire, dividing the flaky meat with our fingers. The taste was incomparable, fresh, clean, and earned through our own efforts. We drank from fast-moving streams, water tasting better than any bottled variety money could buy. "This," Jack said, licking his fingers clean, "is what living feels like." I agreed silently, watching the forest darken around us. We consulted our map occasionally, but increasingly relied on instinct to identify potential campsites. Algonquin's vastness surrounded us, thousands of square miles of wilderness with us positioned deep within its heart, far from roads or ranger outposts. The isolation was intentional, removing all safety nets except our own skills and judgment. The 4th morning arrived with familiar routine. Jack was already awake and packing when I emerged from under my poncho. We consumed the last of our granola, shouldered our packs, and continued northward. The forest grew denser here, limiting conversation as we focused on navigation. Our footfalls created the only consistent sound in an otherwise quiet landscape. Around midday, we paused at a narrow stream to refill canteens. I knelt by the water, splashing my face to clear away sweat and grime when Jack's hand landed heavily on my shoulder. "You see that?" he asked, pointing into the distance. I squinted, following his gaze through the trees. At first, nothing registered, just more forest extending to the horizon. Then I noticed it, a shape with too many straight lines to be natural, barely visible through the foliage. Curiosity piqued. We secured our packs and moved toward the anomaly, pushing through dense underbrush. As trees thinned, the structure became unmistakable. A building stood before us, incongruous among ancient trees, specifically a church, but not as I'd ever seen one before. The structure materialized fully as we approached, and its presence sent an immediate wave of unease through me. The church walls consisted of weathered wood, gray and cracked from decades, perhaps a century, of exposure. The steep roof, covered in moss and fallen pine needles, culminated in a rusted iron cross that tilted precariously against the sky. Another cross hung over the front door, which someone had sealed with weathered boards and secured with heavy chains featuring a massive padlock. Most striking was the building's windowless design. Just a worn, weathered box partially reclaimed by forest growth. No steeple punctuated its simple form. No decorative element softened its utilitarian appearance. It looked built for functionality rather than worship. "What the hell?" I whispered, the sound carrying unnaturally in the still air. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he withdrew our topographical map from his pocket, unfolded it on the ground, and traced our route with his index finger. According to the map, nothing man-made existed within miles of our current position. "This doesn't make sense," I said, pointing to the unmarked area. A church with no roads or paths leading to it? In the middle of Algonquin? Jack carefully refolded the map, his eyes fixed on the building with increasing intensity. Let's check it out. We circled the structure carefully, stepping over twisted roots and ducking low branches. The chained entrance immediately captured my attention. The thick rust coating the metal links and padlock suggested years of abandonment. But as we rounded the building's eastern side, we discovered something more intriguing. A jagged hole in the wooden wall where boards had rotted away. The opening appeared low to the ground and irregular in shape, just large enough for a person to crawl through with effort. Probably an animal, Jack observed, crouching to peer into the darkness beyond. Bears or wolves using it for shelter, maybe. His assessment seemed logical, but when he abruptly removed his backpack and dropped to his hands and knees, alarm bells sounded in my mind. "What are you doing?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Going inside," he replied matter-of-factly. "Don't you want to see what's in there?" I did feel curiosity, but something stronger, a visceral warning, made me hesitate. "Maybe we should just look from out here. Use the flashlights." Jack ignored my suggestion, already positioning himself to crawl through the opening. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" Those words, "what's the worst that could happen?" have preceded countless disasters throughout human history. Unable to let him explore alone, I reluctantly set down my pack and followed, the jagged edges of the hole scraping painfully against my shoulders as I wiggled through. The air inside struck me immediately, damp, cold, and stagnant with the unmistakable mustiness of long abandonment. We stood slowly in the dim interior, brushing dirt from our clothing. Light filtered weakly through the hole and small gaps in the roof, revealing a completely empty space. No pews, no altar, no furniture of any kind. Just bare walls surrounding a packed earth floor littered with crisp, dry leaves. At the far end stood a large wooden cross, weathered but intact. But what commanded immediate attention sat precisely in the room's center, a steel trapdoor embedded in the floor, partially covered with dirt. Heavy-duty bolts secured its edges and thick chains wrapped around its perimeter, fastened with another substantial padlock identical to the one outside. I approached cautiously, examining the metal surface. Unlike everything else in the church, the trapdoor showed minimal aging. No scratches marred its surface, no significant rust degraded its mechanism. Just cold, dirty metal sealed deliberately against intrusion. Jack knelt beside it, giving the chains an experimental tug. They rattled ominously but held firm. Why would anyone need chains this heavy? I wondered aloud, voice echoing slightly in the empty space. Jack looked up, excitement building in his expression. "Maybe it's not actually a church," he suggested. "Could be some kind of hideout or storage facility." "For what?" I asked, though the question felt rhetorical. "Could be anything," he replied, standing and wiping dust from his hands. "Cash, valuables, some smuggler's stash. Why else lock it up like this?" I shook my head, unconvinced. Or it could be something dangerous. Hazardous materials. Something toxic people wanted to hide. My rational argument fell on deaf ears. Jack's expression had changed subtly. A strange intensity now animated his features. His eyes focused with unusual sharpness on the trapdoor. I'd known him for decades and had never seen him look this way before. "We need to get in there," he announced suddenly, moving toward the hole and the forest beyond. "Let's find something to break those chains." "Wait," I called, grabbing his arm as he passed. "You can't be serious." He yanked free with unexpected force, already crawling outside without responding. I scrambled after him, confused by his sudden obsession. Outside, Jack paced the perimeter, kicking at the ground and examining rocks scattered nearby. The purposefulness of his movements unsettled me. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked, though I already knew. "Looking for a rock," he confirmed without looking up. "Something heavy enough to smash that lock." The forest floor offered nothing substantial, just pine needles and small stones inadequate for his purpose. I approached him, trying to inject reason into his sudden fixation. "This is crazy," I said firmly. "Even if something valuable is down there, it clearly belongs to someone who went to extreme lengths to secure it." "So?" Jack replied, disturbingly unconcerned. "So if you're right about valuables, they probably belong to dangerous people. Breaking in would be signing our own death warrants." He didn't even acknowledge my point. "I'll hike until I find something suitable," he declared, striding purposefully into the trees. "However long it takes." His behavior had become so uncharacteristic that alarm transformed to genuine fear, not of the church or trapdoor, but for my friend's mental state. I pursued him, grabbed his shoulder, and physically spun him around. "What the hell has gotten into you?" I demanded. His response was immediate and violent. He shoved me backward with surprising strength. The confrontation escalated rapidly as we grappled among the trees. Our friendship temporarily forgotten in the struggle. Though taller, Jack had always been leaner than me, and I eventually managed to force him against a tree trunk, restraining him before either of us suffered injury. "Stop!" I shouted directly into his face. "Just stop!" Something in my voice or the physical restraint seemed to penetrate his fixation. He froze suddenly, his aggressive posture dissolving. When he released his grip, I stepped back cautiously, both of us breathing heavily from the exertion. "What's happening to you?" I asked more quietly this time. Jack looked up, his face alarmingly pale and damp with sweat. "I don't know," he responded, voice barely audible. "Talk to me," I pressed. "What's going through your head right now?" "I don't know," he repeated, then after a pause, "I couldn't stop thinking about that trapdoor. What might be down there?" He rubbed his temples as though fighting a headache. It felt like I needed to know. Like it was calling to me somehow. His words sent an involuntary shiver through me. I crouched beside him, watching as he gradually returned to himself. "Are you okay to keep moving?" I asked eventually. "Let's put some distance between us and this place." He nodded weakly, and we retrieved our packs in silence, leaving the strange church behind us. But something fundamental had changed, and we both felt it. The remainder of our trip proceeded mechanically. We camped 2 more nights, maintained our routine of hiking, foraging, and water collection, but the enthusiasm that had defined our previous expeditions had vanished. I found myself watching Jack constantly, alert for any recurrence of his disturbing behavior. Though physically present, his mind seemed partially elsewhere, his responses delayed, his usual animated commentary replaced by distracted muttering. On our 5th night, stationed near a small lake miles from the church, I finally confronted him directly. Our small fire provided barely enough light to see his features as I posed the question that had preoccupied me since our discovery. "What really happened back there, Jack? And don't tell me you don't know." He stared into the flames, silent long enough that I wondered if he'd heard me. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar hesitancy. "Have you ever felt pulled toward something? Not just curious, but physically drawn to it?" I shook my head, though the darkness likely obscured the gesture. "That trapdoor," he continued. "When I saw it, everything else just faded away, like nothing mattered except getting it open." His hands trembled slightly as he fed another stick into the fire. "I couldn't hear you anymore. Couldn't think straight. It was like something reached inside my head and flipped a switch." "That doesn't sound like curiosity," I observed. "It sounds like obsession, or something worse." Jack nodded slowly. It wasn't natural. Nothing about it felt right, but I couldn't stop myself. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since the incident. "What do you think would have happened if we'd opened it?" The question hung between us, unanswerable yet disturbing. What indeed lay beneath that reinforced metal door, secured with chains designed to withstand decades of determined intrusion? "Nothing good," I finally replied. "Nothing that should see daylight." "Yeah," Jack agreed softly. "That's what scares me now, because in that moment I would have done anything to find out." Sleep evaded me that night despite physical exhaustion. I lay awake listening to the forest sounds, wind through pine needles, distant animals moving through underbrush, Jack's troubled breathing from beneath his poncho shelter. My mind replayed the church's discovery repeatedly, focusing on details that seemed increasingly significant: the absence from official maps, the remarkable preservation of the trapdoor compared to the decaying structure around it, the immediate and profound effect on Jack's behavior. What haunted me most was the implication that mere proximity to the church had altered something fundamental in my friend's mind. I'd known Jack since childhood, his temperament, his reasoning, his responses to stress and excitement. The person who had fought me over that trapdoor had been Jack, yet simultaneously someone else entirely. Something had reached inside him, redirecting his thoughts and desires toward that sealed opening in the earth. The question that kept me staring into darkness was painfully simple. If nearness alone affected him so dramatically, what might have happened had we succeeded in breaking those chains? The following morning brought heavy rain, soaking us as we packed our meager camp and continued our trek. Jack seemed more himself, joking weakly about our drenched condition, helping me navigate a particularly steep descent. But the easy camaraderie of our previous trips remained absent. Something invisible now stood between us, acknowledged but unaddressed. By late afternoon, the downpour intensified, forcing us to establish camp earlier than planned. We constructed a crude shelter using both our ponchos, huddling beneath while water cascaded around us. The proximity made conversation inevitable. "I keep thinking about that church," Jack admitted, watching raindrops hammer the forest floor. "Not like before, not that weird compulsion, just questions." "Like what?" I asked cautiously. "Like who built it? And why there, in the middle of nowhere?" He gestured vaguely at the forest surrounding us. "Churches need congregations. That place wasn't built for regular services." "Maybe it wasn't always isolated," I suggested. "Could have been a settlement nearby that disappeared. Logging camp or something similar." Jack shook his head. "Then where are the ruins? The roads?" There was nothing but wilderness for miles. I had no satisfactory answer. The church's isolation defied logical explanation, as did its absence from park records. Algonquin had been thoroughly surveyed and mapped. Structures, even abandoned ones, would appear in documentation. "What about the trapdoor?" I asked, despite my better judgment. "Any theories?" Jack's expression darkened. "Too many. Storage cellar, shelter, prison cell. Grave," I added quietly. He nodded. "That too." We fell silent, listening to rain pummel our improvised shelter. The forest surrounding us suddenly seemed less welcoming, its vastness concealing unknown histories and perhaps other anomalous structures forgotten by time and official record-keeping. "We should report it," I suggested eventually. "When we get back. Tell the park rangers." Jack considered this briefly before responding. "And say what? We found an unmapped church with a mysterious trapdoor that made me temporarily insane? They'd laugh us out of the station." He was right, of course. Without photographs or precise coordinates, our account would sound like campfire fiction or the product of wilderness-induced hallucination. Two exhausted campers mistaking a natural formation for something man-made, or exaggerating a minor discovery. "Besides," Jack continued, "part of me doesn't want anyone else finding that place. Some things should stay lost in the woods." His sentiment resonated uncomfortably with my own feelings. Despite rational arguments for reporting our discovery, something deeper warned against drawing attention to the church. Whatever lay beneath that trapdoor had remained sealed for decades, perhaps longer. Maybe it should stay that way. Our final days in Algonquin passed uneventfully. We gradually recovered some of our previous enthusiasm, particularly when a successful fishing attempt provided a welcome change from foraged berries and edible plants. On our last night beneath a clear sky filled with stars impossible to see from Toronto, we almost managed to discuss the church with detached curiosity rather than lingering unease. The Cellar Church, Jack dubbed it, attempting to transform our experience into something approaching humor. Our very own Algonquin mystery. I forced a smile but couldn't fully embrace his attempt at lightness. "Let's hope it remains just that, a mystery." He nodded, understanding my meaning without elaboration. Some mysteries exist not to be solved but avoided entirely. Our return to civilization should have normalized everything: hot showers, proper beds, reliable meals. Yet I found myself struggling to reintegrate. Toronto's constant noise and motion, once familiar and comforting, now felt abrasive and overwhelming. I would catch myself staring out my apartment window toward the northern horizon, thinking about that isolated church standing silent among ancient trees. Jack and I met regularly for drinks, planning future expeditions with apparent enthusiasm, but our conversations inevitably circled back to Algonquin and our discovery. We developed a shorthand, referring to it as the cellar stash, transforming it into an anecdote shared over beers, a strange interlude rather than a disturbing encounter. Jack would grin and shake his head, saying things like, I'd be a millionaire right now if you hadn't stopped me. We'd laugh, change subjects, and pretend the memory carried no weight. Yet neither of us ever suggested returning to that section of Algonquin. When planning subsequent trips, we deliberately selected routes and regions far from that central area where the church stood. This unspoken avoidance contradicted our casual treatment of the memory. If it was merely an amusing story, why did we ensure such geographic distance in our future adventures? Weeks passed, then months. Outwardly, life resumed its predictable patterns. I worked my office job. Jack continued his career in restaurant kitchens, and we maintained our friendship through regular meetups and occasional weekend excursions to nearby conservation areas. Yet inwardly, something had fundamentally changed for me. Sleep became problematic. I would lie awake visualizing the church with perfect clarity, its weathered gray walls, rusted crosses, and especially that trap door sealed with chains and padlocks. Jack's wild theories about hidden treasures seemed increasingly implausible. Something about the structure's isolation and deliberate security measures suggested purposes far more sinister than mere storage. 3 months after our return, I found myself researching Algonquin's history during lunch breaks, searching for any reference to churches, abandoned buildings, or historical settlements within the park boundaries. Official documentation revealed nothing helpful. The area had been designated provincial parkland in 1893, with minimal development beyond recreational facilities and ranger stations. Before that designation, the region had hosted limited logging operations and indigenous communities, but detailed records of structures were sparse. I expanded my search to online forums frequented by experienced backcountry campers, hoping someone might have encountered the same building and shared their experience. Hours scrolling through discussions of Algonquin's trails, wildlife, and camping spots yielded nothing resembling our discovery. If others had found the church, they hadn't documented it publicly. The absence of corroborating information created an unsettling possibility. What if the church didn't exist as I remembered it? What if exhaustion, dehydration, or some environmental factor had caused Jack and me to misperceive something natural as man-made? I dismissed this theory almost immediately. Our experience had been too detailed, too prolonged for hallucination. We had touched those walls, examined that trapdoor, felt the cold metal chains. The church was real regardless of its absence from official records. One evening, roughly 6 months after our Algonquin trip, Jack called unexpectedly. His voice carried an unfamiliar tension that immediately captured my attention. "Are you busy right now?" he asked without preamble. "Just watching TV," I replied. "What's up?" "I need to talk in person." "Can I come over?" 20 minutes later, Jack arrived at my apartment, agitation evident in his restless movements as he paced my small living room. He declined offers of beer or food, focused entirely on whatever had prompted his visit. "I've been having dreams," he finally announced, dropping heavily onto my couch. "About the church. Every night for the past 2 weeks, something cold settled in my stomach." "What kind of dreams?" "Always the same. I'm alone inside the church, standing by that trap door. The chains are gone." He swallowed visibly. "And I'm opening it." "What's inside?" I asked, both dreading and needing to hear his answer. "That's just it. I always wake up right as I'm lifting the door, right at the edge of seeing." His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. "But here's the thing, I wake up feeling excited, like I'm about to receive something I've wanted my entire life." The admission hung between us, its implications disturbing on multiple levels. Jack's expression conveyed confusion and fear, but something else lurked beneath. A hint of the same intense focus I'd witnessed in the forest. "It's just dreams," I offered weakly. Attempting reassurance neither of us believed, subconscious processing the weird experience we had. "Is it?" Jack challenged. "Because last night I woke up halfway to my front door, fully dressed, car keys in hand, like I was leaving. Sleepwalking? Maybe. Or maybe something's trying to pull me back there." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Sometimes I can feel it even when I'm awake, like a tugging inside my head." I contemplated his words, comparing them with my own experience. While the church featured prominently in my thoughts, I'd experienced nothing resembling compulsion or sleepwalking episodes. Whatever affected Jack operated differently or perhaps more intensely with him. Have you considered talking to someone? I suggested carefully. A professional, I mean. Jack laughed humorlessly. And tell them what? That I'm being summoned by a mysterious trapdoor in an abandoned church that doesn't officially exist? That would end well. He had a point. The experience defied conventional psychological explanations, existing in a gray area between trauma response and something altogether different. What about medication? I tried. Something to help you sleep without dreams? Already tried over-the-counter stuff. Doesn't work. He leaned forward, eyes intense. I think I need to go back. Alarm surged through me. That's a terrible idea. Hear me out, he insisted. Maybe seeing it again, confirming it's just a weird old building, would help my brain let it go. Exposure therapy, right? Or it could make everything worse, I countered. What if you have the same reaction as before? What if it's stronger this time? Jack had clearly anticipated my objections. That's why you'd come with me. Keep me from doing anything stupid. We go, take some pictures, leave. Quick validation that it's nothing supernatural, just an abandoned structure with an odd basement. His proposal terrified me precisely because part of me recognized its potential merit. Demystifying our experience through daylight documentation might indeed diminish its psychological impact. Yet simultaneously, returning felt dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate, as though revisiting the church would strengthen whatever connection had formed between it and Jack's mind. Let me think about it, I said eventually. This isn't something to rush into. Jack nodded, visibly relieved that I hadn't immediately rejected the idea. Fair enough, just don't take too long. These dreams are getting worse, not better. After he left, I sat alone contemplating our conversation. Jack's deteriorating mental state demanded action, but returning to Algonquin carried undeniable risks. My instincts screamed warnings against revisiting that place, yet I couldn't abandon my friend to face his growing obsession alone. What troubled me most was the situation's fundamental asymmetry. Whatever influence the church exerted had affected Jack profoundly while barely touching me. His description of feeling pulled toward the trapdoor matched his behavior during our original encounter, a single-minded fixation overriding reason and relationship. If we returned and he experienced that compulsion again, could I physically restrain him, and for how long? I slept poorly that night, mind cycling through scenarios and outcomes none satisfactory. By morning I'd reached a compromise position. We would research more thoroughly before considering a return trip. Perhaps additional information would render physical investigation unnecessary, or at least better prepare us for what we might face. 2 days later, Jack and I met at the Toronto Reference Library, seeking historical information beyond what online searches could provide. The massive facility housed extensive archives, including regional histories, surveyor reports, and newspapers dating back to Ontario's earliest European settlements. If documentation of our mysterious church existed anywhere, this represented our best chance of finding it. We began with historical maps of the Algonquin region, comparing modern topographical surveys with 19th century renderings. Provincial park establishment had changed boundaries and naming conventions, making direct comparisons challenging. Still, we methodically examined each map, seeking any structure marked in the approximate location of our discovery. Hours passed without success. The church remained as absent from historical documentation as from contemporary records. By mid-afternoon, frustration had replaced initial determination, and we expanded our search to regional newspapers and accounts of early settlements. This feels pointless, Jack muttered, closing yet another index volume. Maybe it was built after these records, or by someone who deliberately avoided documentation. I understood his frustration, but continued scanning microfiche copies of a local newspaper from 1897. Something about the isolation and construction of that church suggested age rather than recency. Its weathered timbers and architectural simplicity pointed to 19th century origins rather than modern construction. Near closing time, when exhaustion threatened to end our search, I discovered something promising in an obscure regional history text. A single paragraph referenced a solitary chapel, established by an unnamed religious order in Algonquin's interior during the 1880s, before the area's designation as provincial parkland. The account contained no specific location or purpose, merely noting the structure had been abandoned before completion, following unfortunate events. "Look at this," I called to Jack, pushing the book across the table. He read quickly, expression brightening. "This has to be it. The timing fits, and solitary chapel matches what we saw." "Unfortunate events," I quoted. "Wonder what that means." "Could be anything in the 1880s, Jack reasoned. "Disease outbreak, accident, conflict with locals. Or something connected to whatever's under that trap door," I suggested quietly. The library's closing announcement interrupted further speculation. We photographed the relevant page and several maps for reference, then reluctantly departed with more questions than answers. Our discovery confirmed the church's historical existence but added mystifying context. Why would a religious order establish an isolated chapel only to abandon it before completion? We continued our investigation over dinner at a nearby pub, reviewing our limited findings while constructing theories about the church's origins and purpose. Religious retreats were common in that era, Jack noted between bites of his burger. Maybe it was meant as a meditation space, somewhere deliberately isolated from civilization. "Doesn't explain the trapdoor," I countered, "or why they'd secure it so thoroughly. Storage cellar for provisions?" he suggested without conviction. "They'd need to protect food from animals if they were that remote." We both recognized the inadequacy of this explanation. No ordinary storage area would require such extensive security measures, particularly the heavy chains and industrial-grade padlocks. Whatever lay beneath that steel door had warranted extraordinary precautions against discovery or escape. "We need more information," I concluded. "Something specifically about that religious order and why they abandoned the project." Jack nodded. Agreement, but his expression had subtly changed, the earlier research enthusiasm giving way to something more introspective. "The dream stopped," he said abruptly. "What?" "Since we started researching, 2 nights without dreams about the trapdoor." He looked up, meeting my gaze directly, like it knows we're looking for answers. His statement sent an involuntary shiver through me. The implication of awareness that whatever connection existed between Jack and the church operated bidirectionally crossed a threshold from unsettling to genuinely frightening. "That's good, right?" I managed. "If the dreams have stopped." "Maybe," he replied doubtfully. "Or maybe it's just waiting." I forced a laugh, trying to lighten his ominous suggestion. "Now you're being dramatic. It's an old building with a basement, not some sentient entity." Jack didn't share my attempted humor. "Then why can't I stop thinking about it? Even without the dreams, it's constantly in my head, like background noise that never quite fades." I had no satisfactory response. My own thoughts frequently returned to the church, but never with the compulsive quality Jack described. For him, the experience had transcended memory to become an ongoing psychological presence, less recollection than relationship. Our research continued sporadically over subsequent weeks. Jack located an archival reference to a contemplative order that had established temporary settlements in Ontario's wilderness during the late 19th century, though specific denominations and locations remained unspecified. I discovered a surveyor's journal from 1902 that briefly mentioned remains of previous habitation in Algonquin's interior, but provided no coordinates or detailed descriptions. Each fragment confirmed the historical reality of our discovery, without explaining its anomalous features or absence from official records. The church existed in documentation only as peripheral mentions and vague allusions, its specific purpose and abandonment causes remaining mysterious. 2 months into our investigation, we hit an unexpected breakthrough. Jack's kitchen colleague, hearing about our research interest, mentioned his grandfather had worked as an Algonquin park ranger during the 1960s and possessed journals from that period. He arranged an introduction, and we soon found ourselves in the living room of Edwin Morley, a sharp-minded octogenarian with decades of wilderness experience. Grandfather kept meticulous records, Jack's colleague had explained. If anything unusual existed in his territory, he would have noted it. Edwin greeted us warmly but with evident curiosity about our interest. After brief explanations, carefully framed to avoid sounding irrational, he retrieved several leather-bound journals from a bookshelf. 62 through 68, he explained, setting them on a coffee table. My most active years with the service. What exactly are you looking for? Structures in the interior, I replied. Specifically an old church or chapel that might have been built before the park was established. Recognition flickered across Edwin's weathered features. The Keeper's Chapel, he said quietly. Jack and I exchanged startled glances. You know about it? Jack asked, trying to control his excitement. Edwin nodded slowly, selecting a journal marked 1964 and carefully turning brittle pages. It wasn't on official maps even then. More legend than documented landmark. Rangers knew about it, but visitors weren't guided there. Why not? I pressed. Edwin found his desired page and adjusted his reading glasses. Bad history. Bad feeling about the place. He began reading from his journal. April 18, 1964. Northwestern Patrol extended due to reported smoke sightings. No evidence of campfires or unauthorized activity. Diverted to examine condition of Keeper's Chapel following winter storms. Structure remains intact despite age. Door chains maintained. Advised headquarters of inspection as per protocol. He looked up from the journal, observing our reactions. There were standing orders to check it periodically, but otherwise leave it undisturbed. The Keeper's Chapel, Jack repeated. Who or what was being kept? Edwin shrugged slightly. Before my time. Old-timers wouldn't discuss it directly, just said it was best left alone. Some mentioned it wasn't originally a chapel at all, but something else entirely. Was there anything about a trapdoor inside? I asked, or what might be underneath? The older man's expression shifted subtly, caution replacing conversational openness. You've been there, he stated rather than asked. Recently? We nodded confirmation. And you saw inside? Through a hole in the wall, Jack explained. The main door was still chained. Edwin closed his journal deliberately. Then you saw the floor access. Did you attempt to open it? No, I answered quickly. It was chained too, but we were curious about what it might contain. Relief visibly passed through the former ranger. Good, very good. He leaned forward, voice lowering despite our private setting. Listen carefully. That structure was built for containment, not worship. The religious elements came later, attempts to sanctify what couldn't be destroyed. His statement confirmed my worst suspicions while raising countless new questions. Containment of what? I ventured. Edwin shook his head firmly. Some questions shouldn't be answered. Some knowledge shouldn't be sought. He tapped his closed journal. Even in these private records, I never documented what senior rangers told me about that place. Some things are better left unwritten. Jack's frustration showed clearly. We need to understand. I've been having dreams. Dreams? Edwin interrupted sharply, newfound alarm evident. About the chapel? About the trapdoor specifically, Jack admitted. Opening it. The elderly man's face paled visibly. That's how it begins, he whispered. First dreams, then waking thoughts. Eventually compulsion. He studied Jack intently. How long since you visited the site? About 7 months, I answered when Jack hesitated. Edwin nodded slowly. Distance usually weakens the effect. Unless susceptibility is high, he turned directly to Jack. You must not return there, under any circumstances. Distance is your only protection. Protection from what? Jack demanded, voice rising with frustration. Everyone speaks in riddles about this place. I need concrete information. No, Edwin replied firmly. You don't. Knowledge strengthens connection. Understanding deepens vulnerability. He collected his journals with deliberate movements. I'll tell you only this. What lies beneath that chapel was sealed there for essential reasons by people who understood exactly what they confronted. The chains aren't to keep curious hikers out. They're to keep something else in. His cryptic warning concluded our meeting, leaving us with confirmation of the church's significance but few actionable details. As we departed, Edwin pressed a small object into my hand, a tarnished silver medallion bearing unfamiliar symbols. If the dreams worsen or compulsion strengthens, he instructed quietly, place this under his pillow. It may help create distance. I pocketed the item without question, thanking him for his time. Outside, walking toward the subway station, Jack finally verbalized our shared frustration. That was simultaneously enlightening and completely useless, he complained. We confirmed the church exists and has an official designation, but learned nothing concrete about what it contains or why it affects me specifically. I considered Edwin's deliberately vague warnings, weighing them against our months of research. I think his generation practiced intentional obscurity, I suggested. They knew enough to recognize danger but chose to protect through ignorance rather than education. Well, it's not working, Jack replied bitterly. Ignorance hasn't stopped these dreams or thoughts. If anything, the mystery makes it worse. He was right, of course. Our investigation had provided historical validation without practical understanding. We knew the church, the Keeper's Chapel, had been built for containment rather than worship, but remained ignorant about what required such isolation and security. Edwin's warning against return offered no alternative solution for Jack's ongoing psychological connection to the site. That evening, alone in my apartment, I examined the medallion Edwin had given me. Its surface featured intricate engravings, concentric circles surrounding a complex geometric pattern. Though clearly designed with symbolic intent, its meaning and origin remained mysterious. I couldn't determine whether it represented religious iconography, occult symbolism, or something entirely different. Following Edwin's instructions, I mailed it to Jack the next morning with a brief note explaining its purported purpose. He responded with skeptical thanks, promising to try the suggested placement despite doubts about its efficacy. What struck me most about his message was a subtle shift in tone, a resignation replacing previous agitation, as though he'd accepted his condition as permanent rather than solvable. 2 weeks passed without communication, unusual for our typically regular contact. When I finally called his apartment, Jack answered on the first ring, voice alert despite the late hour. I was just thinking about you, he said, an odd formality coloring his usual casual greeting. We should talk. Everything okay? I asked, immediately concerned. Better than okay, he replied with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. I've gained perspective, clarity about our situation. His phrasing, our situation rather than my problem, immediately triggered concern. What kind of clarity? Not over the phone, he insisted. Meet me tomorrow? The coffee shop near your office, noon? I agreed without hesitation, simultaneously relieved at his apparent improvement and unsettled by the abrupt change. Throughout our friendship, Jack had never been one for dramatic announcements or mysterious meetings. His new approach suggested a fundamental shift in personality or perspective. Sleep proved elusive that night, my mind constructing scenarios for our upcoming conversation. Had the medallion worked as Edwin suggested, creating psychological distance from the church's influence, or had Jack found alternative information explaining his connection to the site? Most concerning was the possibility that his improved mood signaled surrender rather than resolution, acceptance of compulsion rather than liberation from it. The following day, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table offering privacy for our conversation. Jack appeared precisely at noon, punctuality being another uncharacteristic behavior. He moved with unusual purpose, navigating between tables with fluid confidence rather than his typical casual amble. Thanks for coming, he greeted, sliding into the seat opposite mine. His appearance startled me. He'd lost weight since our last meeting, his face thinner and more angular. Dark circles beneath his eyes suggested ongoing sleep disturbances despite his energetic demeanor. You said you've gained clarity, I prompted after brief pleasantries. About the church? He nodded, leaning forward with intensity. I've been thinking about Edwin's warnings about containment versus worship. His voice lowered conspiratorially. What if they got it backward? What if whatever's beneath that chapel isn't something dangerous needing containment, but something valuable requiring protection? The theory wasn't entirely implausible, yet something in his eager delivery unsettled me deeply. Valuable how? I questioned cautiously. Knowledge, he replied immediately. Understanding beyond conventional limits. Think about it. Religious orders throughout history have sequestered sacred texts and artifacts, protecting them from destruction or misuse. His eyes gleamed with enthusiasm. What if the Keeper's Chapel doesn't imprison something dangerous, but preserves something transformative? His theory directly contradicted Edwin's warnings while conveniently aligning with his ongoing compulsion. This reframing transformed restriction into invitation, changing chains from barriers to protective measures guarding something precious. That's an interesting perspective, I acknowledged neutrally. What led you to this conclusion? Jack hesitated briefly before responding. The dreams changed. I'm still opening the trapdoor, but now I can see inside. Just glimpses, but enough to recognize possibility. What kind of possibility? I pressed, increasingly concerned by his evident excitement. Knowledge, connection, understanding beyond anything we've imagined. He leaned closer, voice barely audible. I think it's been calling to me specifically because I'm somehow prepared to receive what it offers. The medallion Edwin provided clearly hadn't diminished Jack's connection to the chapel. If anything, his psychological attachment had strengthened and evolved. Most alarming was his personalization of the experience. The belief that he specifically had been chosen, or was uniquely prepared, for whatever lay beneath that trapdoor. Jack, I began carefully, has it occurred to you that these feelings might be exactly what Edwin warned against? The strengthening compulsion he mentioned? His expression hardened slightly. Edwin knows only what others told him. Second-hand warnings from people who feared what they didn't understand. He dismissed the concern with a wave. Besides, I've never felt clearer or more focused. This claim contradicted his physical appearance. The weight loss and evident exhaustion suggesting ongoing stress rather than newfound clarity. His certainty possessed an almost religious quality, faith replacing the questioning approach that had characterized our research. What exactly are you planning? I asked directly, suspecting his answer before he spoke. We need to return, he confirmed. Complete what we started. Open the trapdoor and discover what's been waiting for us. The plurality of his statement, waiting for us rather than waiting for me, didn't escape my notice. Despite claiming unique receptivity, he still positioned me as a necessary participant in this revelation. Whether from genuine desire for shared experience or need for practical assistance with the chains, he clearly viewed my involvement as essential. That's not happening, I stated firmly. Edwin made it clear returning would be dangerous, especially for you. Jack's expression shifted from enthusiasm to calculation. I'm going with or without you, he declared, but it would be safer with help. His manipulation was transparent yet effective, framing my participation as harm reduction rather than endorsement. If determined to return regardless of my input, accompanying him might indeed provide opportunity for intervention or restraint. When are you thinking of going? I asked, buying time while considering options. This weekend, he replied immediately. I've already requested days off work and prepped equipment. The immediacy of his plan shocked me. That's in 3 days. He nodded confirmation. The sooner the better. The connection is strongest now. I can feel it calling more clearly than ever. We spent the next hour in careful negotiation, me delaying without outright refusal, him pressing for commitment without revealing the full extent of his preparations. We eventually reached an uncomfortable compromise. I would accompany him to Algonquin, but maintained veto power over approaching the chapel depending on his mental state upon arrival. After our meeting, I immediately called Edwin Morley, explaining Jack's deteriorating condition and imminent plans. The elderly man's response confirmed my worst fears. The connection has progressed too far, he stated grimly. The medallion works only in early stages before the calling establishes deep roots. What exactly is calling to him? I demanded, abandoning pretense of measured inquiry. You know more than you've shared? Edwin sighed heavily. Knowledge passed verbally through generations of rangers suggested an entity, something ancient that predated European settlement. Indigenous peoples avoided that region entirely, considering it spiritually contaminated. His voice lowered. The religious order that built the chapel attempted to contain rather than destroy what they found. Their journals reportedly described it as older than Christian understanding and patient beyond human comprehension. How does it connect with certain people? I pressed. Susceptibility varies, Edwin explained. Some individuals resonate more strongly with its influence. Once connection establishes, physical distance becomes increasingly irrelevant. How do we break the connection? I asked, focusing on practical solutions. Edwin's hesitation spoke volumes. Traditional methods involve immersion in moving water, lakes, rivers, waterfalls. Temporary effectiveness at best. He paused. In advanced cases like your friend's, the only permanent solution is... He didn't complete the sentence, but his meaning registered clearly. Jack's condition had progressed beyond simple intervention. Whatever influence emanated from that chapel had embedded itself thoroughly in his consciousness, reshaping his perceptions and desires toward a single purpose, returning to open that trap door. I need to stop him from going back, I concluded. Yes, Edwin agreed quietly. By any means necessary. Despite my best efforts to dissuade him through rational arguments and emotional appeals, Jack remained fixated on returning to Algonquin. His determination had transformed into something approaching religious fervor, an unshakable conviction that answers awaited him beneath that rusted trap door. Our friendship, once defined by mutual respect and consideration, now strained under the weight of his single-minded obsession. I considered extreme measures, contacting his family with fabricated concerns about his mental health, reporting a vague threat to park authorities, even contemplating physical intervention if necessary. Each option presented significant ethical dilemmas without guaranteeing his safety. Ultimately, I concluded that accompanying him offered the best chance to protect him from whatever awaited at the Keeper's Chapel. 3 days later, we departed Toronto before dawn, Jack driving with uncharacteristic focus and minimal conversation. The familiar route north triggered memories of previous trips, carefree adventures unmarred by the darkness that now accompanied us. Jack had changed physically in the weeks since our coffee shop meeting, losing more weight while developing an almost feverish energy that manifested in constant motion and darting glances. You seem different, I observed as we passed Huntsville, attempting to gauge his mental state. Focused, he replied without elaboration, eyes fixed on the highway ahead. Edwin's warnings didn't concern you at all? I pressed, seeking any indication of caution or doubt. Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Edwin knows stories. I know truth. What truth? That I've been chosen. That completion awaits. His certainty carried the unmistakable quality of delusion. Absolute conviction impervious to contradiction or evidence. We reached Algonquin's western entrance by mid-morning, parking at the same trailhead we'd used 7 months earlier. Jack moved with mechanical efficiency, shouldering his pack and checking coordinates on his GPS unit. Unlike our previous expedition, this trip featured minimal equipment, just essentials for overnight camping and tools I suspected were intended for breaking chains. We should reach the chapel by late afternoon if we maintain good pace, he announced, already striding toward the forest. I want to arrive before sunset. I followed silently, mentally reviewing the contents of my own pack. Beyond standard camping gear, I carried 3 items Edwin had pressed upon me during a hurried meeting the previous evening. A flask of water from a specific waterfall within the park, a small cloth pouch containing herbs and minerals of unspecified purpose, and explicit instructions for their use if Jack's behavior escalated beyond reason. Last resort measures, Edwin had explained gravely. Traditional methods passed down through generations. Effectiveness uncertain, particularly against advanced influence. The uncertainty proved far from reassuring, but I accepted the items gratefully, recognizing them as my only concrete resources against whatever awaited us at the chapel. Our hike proceeded with grim efficiency, Jack setting a punishing pace that left little breath for conversation. Unlike previous trips characterized by appreciation of natural surroundings and companionable silences, this journey felt purposeful and tense, a mission rather than an adventure. Jack consulted his GPS obsessively, making minor course corrections to maintain direct routing toward our destination. His navigational certainty contrasted sharply with our initial discovery of the chapel, which had occurred through chance rather than deliberate tracking. How can you be so precise about its location? I questioned during a brief water break. It didn't appear on any maps. I know exactly where it is, he replied without elaboration, as though the knowledge existed independently of maps or memory. By mid-afternoon, the forest began displaying familiar characteristics. The specific density of pine and birch, the slight elevation changes, the pattern of underbrush growth. Even without GPS guidance, I recognized our approach to the chapel's location, a realization that sent involuntary shivers through my exhausted body. Jack's pace accelerated as recognition dawned, his movements becoming almost frantic with anticipation. When the chapel finally appeared through thinning trees, gray walls exactly as remembered, he stopped abruptly, breath catching audibly. "It's waiting," he whispered, an unsettling smile spreading across his gaunt features. The structure stood unchanged since our departure, weathered walls supporting a moss-covered roof, rusted cross-tilting precariously against the sky, main entrance secured with heavy chains and padlock. The forest had reclaimed no additional territory during our absence. The building remained suspended in its peculiar state of partial decay, neither collapsing further nor fully surrendering to natural reclamation. Jack approached reverently, circling toward the hole in the eastern wall that had provided our original entry. I followed cautiously, hands drifting unconsciously toward my pack containing Edwin's supplies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through surrounding trees, creating disorienting patterns across the chapel's weathered exterior. "Jack?" I called, attempting one final intervention. "Let's set up camp first. Approach this with clear heads tomorrow morning." He ignored my suggestion completely, already dropping to his knees beside the jagged opening. Without hesitation, he removed his pack and crawled inside, disappearing into the chapel's dim interior before I could formulate further objections. Left with no alternative, I followed reluctantly, the rough edges of the hole scraping against my shoulders just as they had months earlier. Inside, the air hung heavy with the same damp coldness I remembered, though an additional quality now permeated the atmosphere, an almost electric tension that raised goosebumps along my arms. Jack stood precisely where I expected, directly beside the steel trap door in the chapel's center. The chains remained intact, wrapped securely around the perimeter and fastened with the substantial padlock we recalled. He stared downward with singular focus, apparently oblivious to my entry or presence. "It's speaking," he murmured, kneeling beside the metal surface. "Can you hear it?" I remained silent, observing his behavior with mounting concern. One hand caressed the chains almost lovingly while the other reached for his pack, retrieving a heavy-duty bolt cutter partially concealed beneath other equipment. "Jack," I began carefully, "think about what you're doing. Edwin warned specifically against—" "Edwin fears what he doesn't understand," Jack interrupted sharply. "What they all feared. But I understand now. I've been prepared." He positioned the bolt cutter around a chain link, arm muscles tensing with anticipated exertion. Acting instinctively, I lunged forward, grabbing his wrist before he could apply pressure. "Stop," I demanded. "This isn't you talking. Something's influencing your thoughts." Jack's response came with shocking violence. He twisted suddenly, driving his elbow into my sternum with enough force to send me sprawling backward. The unexpected attack left me gasping for breath while he returned his attention to the chains, cutting through the first link with a metallic snap that echoed ominously through the empty structure. "I'm sorry," he said without looking up, continuing methodically to the next link. "But nothing can prevent completion now. It's waited too long already." Despite throbbing pain in my chest, I scrambled toward my discarded pack, frantically retrieving Edwin's waterfall flask. The elderly man's instructions echoed in my mind. Direct contact with the influenced person. Water must touch skin to create temporary barrier. Jack had severed 3 chain links by the time I regained my footing, the padlock now hanging uselessly from partially loosened restraints. His movements displayed practiced efficiency, suggesting he had rehearsed this process mentally or physically before our arrival. I uncapped the flask, approaching cautiously from behind. "Jack, please," I attempted one final verbal intervention. "Whatever's calling to you isn't offering knowledge. It's using you." He paused briefly, head tilting as though listening to contradictory voices. This momentary hesitation provided my opportunity. I lunged forward, splashing the flask's contents directly onto his exposed neck and face. His reaction was immediate and horrifying. A scream erupted from his throat, raw and animal in its intensity, as he recoiled from the metal door, hands clawing at his dampened skin. His body convulsed violently, collapsing sideways onto the dirt floor while unintelligible sounds continued pouring from his mouth. I knelt beside him, heart pounding with fear and regret. "Jack, can you hear me?" His convulsions gradually subsided, replaced by shuddering breaths and disoriented blinking. When his eyes finally focused on mine, I saw confusion rather than obsession. The first glimpse of my actual friend since our discovery of the chapel months earlier. "What?" he managed weakly. "Where are we? What happened?" Relief flooded through me. "You're okay. We're in Algonquin, the chapel." I helped him to sitting position, supporting his trembling frame. "Do you remember coming here?" He shook his head slowly, eyes widening as surroundings registered. "The trapdoor," he whispered, gaze fixing on the partially unchained metal surface. "God, what was I doing?" "Something was influencing you," I explained gently, "drawing you back here." Recognition dawned gradually across his features, memories apparently returning in disjointed fragments. The dreams, the voices, horror replaced confusion. I was going to open it. I wanted to open it more than anything. "But you didn't," I reassured him. "We stopped in time." Jack struggled to stand, leaning heavily against me. "We need to leave now before it starts again." I nodded emphatic agreement, gathering our discarded packs while supporting his unsteady movements toward the wall opening. The trapdoor remained partially secured, 3 severed chain links leaving the majority still interwoven around its perimeter. Though functionally weakened, the restraints maintained visual integrity. Whatever lay beneath remained contained, if less securely than before. Outside, afternoon had surrendered to early evening, long shadows stretching across the forest floor. Jack stumbled toward a fallen log several meters from the chapel, collapsing onto it with visible exhaustion. "How bad was I?" he asked quietly, face buried in trembling hands. I hesitated, weighing honesty against compassion. "Pretty bad. Focused on opening that door to the exclusion of everything else." He nodded miserably. "I remember feelings more than details, certainty, purpose, like nothing else mattered except getting back here." His voice broke slightly. It wasn't me thinking those thoughts, but they felt like mine. "Edwin called it influence," I explained, sitting beside him. "Something from beneath the chapel reaching out, establishing connection with susceptible individuals." "Like infection," Jack murmured. "Or possession." Neither characterization seemed inaccurate based on witnessed behavior. Whatever force emanated from beneath that trap door operated with intelligence and purpose, selecting specific targets and steadily reshaping their thoughts toward a single objective, releasing it from confinement. "How did you stop me?" Jack asked eventually. "I vaguely remember water." Traditional method according to Edwin. Water from a specific waterfall within the park. I patted my pack containing the remaining supplies. He provided emergency interventions, though he wasn't certain they'd work against advanced influence. Jack looked up sharply. "Advanced?" "Your connection progressed quickly, more intensely than typical cases apparently." I softened my tone, seeing alarm in his expression. "But the water worked. You're yourself again." "For now," he added quietly. "What if it's temporary? What if it starts again once the water dries?" His concern matched my own unspoken fears. Edwin had characterized the intervention as creating temporary barriers rather than permanent severance. The influence might indeed reassert itself given time and proximity. "We should move further away," I suggested, standing and offering assistance. "Make camp somewhere distant from the chapel. Tomorrow we hike out at first light." Jack accepted help, rising, legs still unsteady beneath him. "And if it comes back?" "The compulsion? More waterfall water," I assured him. "And distance." Edwin believed physical separation eventually weakens the connection in most cases. "Most cases," Jack repeated hollowly. We gathered our packs and moved away from the chapel, Jack frequently glancing backward as though expecting pursuit. Each step seemed to require conscious effort. His body apparently conflicted between departure and return. By the time we'd covered half a kilometer, night had begun settling around us, necessitating camp establishment in a small clearing beside a shallow stream. Jack collapsed immediately onto his ground sheet, physical and emotional exhaustion claiming dominance over residual fear. "Will you keep watch?" he requested, voice already slurring with approaching sleep. "Wake me if I try anything." "I'll watch," I promised, arranging my position strategically between him and the direction of the chapel. Despite expectations of resistance, sleep claimed him almost instantly, the first natural rest he'd likely experienced in weeks. I maintained vigilant observation, prepared to intervene if his behavior indicated returning influence. However, his breathing remained deep and regular throughout early evening hours, body occasionally twitching but never showing signs of rising. My own exhaustion gradually demanded attention, eyelids growing heavy despite determination to maintain watch. Fighting fatigue proved increasingly difficult as minutes stretched to hours without incident. Eventually, practicality forced compromise, i.e., positioned Edwin's remaining supplies within immediate reach before allowing myself brief periods of light sleep, jerking awake frequently to check Jack's condition. Morning arrived with gray drizzle filtering through overhead branches. I woke fully to discover Jack already upright, silently packing his equipment with methodical precision. His expression remained unreadable in the dim light, prompting immediate concern. "How are you feeling?" I asked cautiously, hand drifting toward the waterfall flask. He glanced up, eyes clear and focused. "Like myself, mostly." His movements maintained efficiency without the feverish quality that had characterized the previous day's behavior. The dreams came back briefly during the night, not as strong but present. "Why didn't you wake me?" I demanded, alarm replacing relief. "You needed rest too," he replied simply. "Besides, they were just dreams this time, no compulsion to act." He secured his pack with a final adjustment. "But we should leave quickly. I don't trust this clarity to last near that place." We abandoned camp without preparing breakfast, prioritizing departure over comfort. Jack set a deliberately measured pace, conserving energy while maintaining steady progress away from the chapel. Though physically weakened, his navigational skills remained intact, establishing efficient routing toward the trailhead. "I keep thinking about those chains," he commented during a brief water break several hours into our hike. "I damaged them, weakened the seal." "Most links remained intact," I reminded him. "The trapdoor is still secured." "But less effectively than before," he countered. "What if that's enough? What if it can now reach further, influence more people?" The possibility had occupied my thoughts throughout our journey, but I'd avoided voicing it aloud. "We should tell Edwin. Report the damage so proper authorities can repair it." Jack nodded agreement, but his expression suggested limited faith in official response. Those chains were ancient, maybe original to whatever religious order built the chapel. Who would even know how to properly restore them now? His question highlighted the fundamental problem with structures like the Keeper's Chapel, protection systems established by previous generations with specific knowledge and purpose, maintained through tradition rather than understanding. When tradition faltered or knowledge disappeared, protections became increasingly vulnerable to failure. We reached the trailhead by late afternoon, both exhausted but relieved by return to civilization. Jack's condition had stabilized throughout our journey, dreams and compulsive thoughts apparently diminishing with increasing distance from the chapel. By the time we reached his vehicle, he displayed no observable symptoms beyond normal fatigue and lingering psychological distress. "What happens now?" he asked as we loaded our equipment. "Long term, I mean." Edwin suggested continued distance, I recalled, avoiding that section of Algonquin entirely, breaking patterns that might reinforce connection. "And if that's not enough?" Jack pressed. "If the dreams continue despite distance?" I retrieved Edwin's cloth pouch from my pack, offering it to Jack. He provided this as ongoing protection. Didn't specify exact contents or usage, just that it contains traditional elements for maintaining barriers. Jack accepted the small bundle cautiously, examining its hand-stitched exterior. "Seems inadequate against whatever that thing is." "It's what we have," I replied simply. The drive back to Toronto passed mostly in silence, both of us processing events through individual lenses. Jack occasionally shared fragments of memory from his influenced period, disjointed impressions of voices, certainties, and compelling visions that had directed his actions. Each recollection emerged with evident distress, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he forced words into coherent form. It wasn't evil exactly, he attempted explaining at one point. Not in traditional terms, more fundamentally different, operating on principles and purposes beyond human understanding. Different enough to be dangerous, I noted. He nodded slowly. Precisely because of that difference. Like deep-sea creatures brought to surface environments, destruction occurs through incompatible contexts rather than malicious intent. His analogy provided cold comfort. Intent mattered less than impact when considering potential harm, and something capable of exerting such profound influence across physical distance clearly possessed significant power, regardless of purpose. We reached Toronto after nightfall, streetlights and traffic marking jarring transition from wilderness isolation to urban density. Jack parked outside my apartment building, engine idling as we contemplated appropriate farewells under extraordinary circumstances. "Thank you," he said eventually, meeting my gaze directly. "For stopping me, for coming back with me despite knowing the risks." I accepted his gratitude with a simple nod. "Will you be okay tonight? You could stay over if you're concerned about being alone." He shook his head. "I need to face this independently at some point. Might as well start now." His attempted smile fell short of convincing. "Besides, I have Edwin's magic pouch and instructions to call immediately if anything changes." We embraced briefly before parting, the gesture carrying more significance than typical goodbyes. Jack promised to check in regularly as he adjusted to post-influence recovery, assuring me the dreams had continued fading throughout our return journey. Alone in my apartment, I showered away days of accumulated wilderness grime, watching filthy water disappear down the drain while contemplating our narrow escape. The shower's white noise couldn't fully drown out recurring thoughts. Jack's feverish determination, the partially damaged chains, the certainty that whatever lay beneath that trapdoor remained alert and patient behind weakened restraints. Sleep came reluctantly that night, despite physical exhaustion. When consciousness finally surrendered to slumber, dreams arrived immediately. Not of the chapel directly, but forest pathways leading inexorably toward its location. I navigated densely wooded terrain with dream logic certainty, each step drawing me closer to that weathered structure and its central secret. I woke sweating and disoriented at 3:17 a.m., momentary confusion giving way to cold realization. The influence had transferred. Weaker, more distant, but unmistakably present. The same compulsive curiosity that had originally claimed Jack now reached tentatively toward my consciousness. Morning brought temporary clarity with rational daylight thoughts. I called Edwin immediately, describing both the weakened chains and my disturbing dreams. His extended silence following my account confirmed the seriousness of both developments. "The containment has been compromised," he finally stated, "and you've become secondary target for influence." "Secondary? Your friend established primary connection," Edwin explained. "You've developed connection through proximity to him and the site itself, weaker but potentially strengthening over time. How do I stop it?" I asked directly. "Distance helped your friend. Should help you as well." His voice carried uncertainty despite reassuring words. "The pouch contents, keep them close, particularly during sleep. Traditional barriers remain somewhat effective against peripheral influence." "And the chapel itself?" I pressed. "The damaged chains?" "I've notified individuals who maintain awareness of the site," he replied carefully. "They'll implement appropriate measures." "What measures exactly?" I challenged, frustrated by continued vagueness. Edwin sighed audibly. "Temporary reinforcement of remaining restraints. Possibly relocation of the entire structure if degradation continues." His tone suggested limited confidence in either approach. "Relocation wouldn't address whatever's beneath the trapdoor," I pointed out. "No," he agreed grimly. "That presents more complex challenges beyond current capabilities." Our conversation concluded with mutual promises of continued communication if circumstances changed. Edwin committed to weekly check-ins regarding my mental state, particularly dream content and any developing compulsive thoughts. Jack and I maintained regular contact throughout subsequent weeks, comparing experiences and recovery progress. His dreams diminished steadily with continued distance from Algonquin, though occasional intense episodes still disrupted his sleep. My own dreams remained consistently present, but lacked the overwhelming compulsion he had originally experienced, suggesting Edwin's assessment of secondary or peripheral connection was accurate. We developed personal mitigation strategies. Jack relocated temporarily to his sister's home in Montreal, maximizing geographical separation from the chapel. I relied heavily on Edwin's herbal pouch, keeping it beneath my pillow nightly while researching traditional protective practices from various cultural traditions. Neither approach eliminated the connection entirely, but both seemed to maintain functional barriers against strengthening influence. 3 months after our return trip, Jack called unexpectedly late one evening. His voice carried the first genuine excitement I'd heard since before our Algonquin disaster. "The dreams stopped completely," he announced without preamble. 2 weeks without a single one. Relief flooded through me. "That's fantastic news. Since Montreal?" "Yes, but this feels different from gradual fading. More like sudden severance." His tone shifted toward cautious optimism. "I think whatever it is has stopped reaching for me." "Why would it stop?" I questioned, immediately suspicious of convenient resolution. Jack hesitated before responding. "Maybe it found someone more receptive, someone closer." The implication settled heavily between us. If the entity beneath the chapel operated with limited capacity for external connection, resources previously focused on Jack might have been redirected toward more accessible targets, potentially including me or others who had encountered the site. "Have your dreams changed?" he asked, confirming my unspoken concern. "Not significantly," I answered honestly. "Still present but manageable." "Be careful," he advised unnecessarily. "If my theory is correct and it's redirecting attention rather than simply weakening overall." He didn't complete the thought, leaving implications hanging unspoken. If the entity had simply transferred focus rather than lost strength, my secondary connection might intensify to replace Jack's severed primary channel. "I'll maintain precautions," I assured him. "Keep Edwin updated about any changes." Over subsequent weeks, Jack's recovery continued impressively. He returned from Montreal to resume his Toronto life, showing no signs of recurring influence despite proximity reduction. My own condition remained stable rather than improving. Dreams consistently present but contained. Occasional intrusive thoughts about the chapel appearing during waking hours but easily dismissed through conscious effort. Edwin monitored both situations with evident interest, particularly the apparent transfer of primary focus away from Jack. During one of our regular calls, he shared limited information about chapel remediation efforts. "The site has been temporarily secured," he explained vaguely. "Additional measures implemented around the structure itself." "What about beneath it?" I pressed. "The actual source?" "Beyond current capabilities," he admitted reluctantly. "Some things can only be contained, not eliminated." His assessment provided little comfort but confirmed suspicions developed through months of experience with the entity's persistent influence. Whatever lay beneath that trapdoor possessed resilience and adaptability beyond conventional threats, capable of reaching across significant distances, establishing psychological connections with strategic patience, and potentially redirecting focus when particular channels closed. Jack and I gradually resumed normal friendship patterns, though we tacitly avoided camping or wilderness activities by mutual unspoken agreement. We transformed our extraordinary experience into occasional dark humor, referring to the cellar stash during nights, out or jokingly attributing unusual behavior to chapel influence. These attempts at normalization provided psychological distance while acknowledging shared trauma that outsiders could never fully comprehend. Years have passed since our encounters with the Keeper's Chapel. Jack has recovered completely, showing no lingering effects from his temporary obsession with the trapdoor. He married, changed careers, and moved forward with life apparently unburdened by persistent connection to that isolated structure. I've been less fortunate. Though the influence never intensified to levels Jack experienced, It never fully disappeared either. Dreams about the chapel occur with stubborn regularity, not every night but frequently enough to maintain awareness of continued connection. During particularly vivid episodes, I find myself standing before that partially unchained trapdoor, hearing indistinct whispers from beneath the metal surface. Edwin passed away peacefully last winter, leaving behind journals documenting his ranger experiences and mysterious encounters within Algonquin's vast wilderness. His family, knowing our connection, shared entries specifically referencing the chapel, careful observations of the structure's condition over decades of regular monitoring. His final notation, made 3 months before his death, mentioned evidence of regular inspection and maintenance by designated authorities, suggesting the containment system continues receiving attention despite his absence. I've maintained personal protective measures, Edwin's herbal pouch replaced regularly with identical components, sleeping rituals designed to minimize dream vulnerability, and most importantly, absolute avoidance of Algonquin Park and surrounding regions. These precautions establish workable equilibrium rather than complete liberation, allowing functional life despite persistent shadows of past encounter. Jack and I still meet regularly, though we discuss the chapel less frequently as years advance. During one recent dinner, after several drinks lowered usual conversational barriers, he asked the question we'd both avoided articulating directly. Do you think we did the right thing? Leaving it there? The question's complexity defied simple response. We had followed Edwin's guidance, reporting damaged restraints while maintaining established containment rather than attempting more permanent resolution. Whether this represented courage or cowardice remained unanswerable, without fuller understanding of what exactly lay beneath that chapel floor. I don't think we had capacity to do anything else, I finally replied. Some situations exceed individual responsibility. Jack nodded slowly, accepting this limited reassurance. I sometimes wonder if others have found it since then, if it's establishing new connections, drawing new people toward that trapdoor. His concern mirrored my own recurring thoughts, the entity's apparent patience and strategic approach suggesting long-term perspective beyond human timeframes. What represented significant years for us might constitute mere moments in its perception, each failed opportunity followed by renewed attempts with different susceptible individuals. The Rangers know about it, I reminded him. Edwin's colleagues continue monitoring the site. Until they don't, Jack countered grimly. Until knowledge fades or priorities, change or development encroaches further into Algonquin's interior. His observation highlighted fundamental vulnerability in any containment system dependent on human maintenance and awareness. Institutional memory degrades over generations. Protective rituals become empty gestures without understanding their purpose. Wilderness barriers diminish through accessibility improvements and technological advancement. Maybe that's why it keeps reaching out, I suggested. It recognizes the inevitable entropy of human systems and waits patiently for failure. Jack shivered visibly despite the restaurant's comfortable temperature. That's the most terrifying possibility, that it's not just sentient but strategic, playing extremely long games. We finished our meal in thoughtful silence, departing with unusually somber goodbyes. Though we'd constructed functional lives around our experience, conversations like this revealed persistent undercurrents of uncertainty and responsibility that would likely never fully resolve. That night, predictably, dreams of the chapel returned with unusual clarity. I stood inside the weathered structure, ambient light filtering through roof gaps to illuminate the central trapdoor. The chains remained partially broken, exactly as we'd left them years earlier, though strange symbols now marked the surrounding dirt floor, unfamiliar characters suggesting subsequent visitors had performed rituals or protective measures around the compromised seal. In this dream, unlike previous iterations, I approached the metal surface voluntarily, curious rather than compelled. No whispers emerged from beneath. No sense of external influence directed my movements. I knelt beside the trapdoor, examining damage we'd inadvertently caused through Jack's obsessive intervention years earlier. 3 severed links hung uselessly among otherwise intact chains, the pattern exactly matching memory of our confrontation. I reached toward one broken segment, fingers closing around cool metal with dream-tangible realism. As contact established, dream logic shifted perspective suddenly. awareness expanding beyond physical confines to encompass the chapel's complete history. Perceived its original construction not as religious sanctuary, but deliberate containment structure. Builders working with knowledge passed through generations about what lay beneath that specific forest location. The religious elements, crosses, chapel design came later. Attempts to sanctify and reinforce physical barriers with spiritual protection, drawn from belief systems that postdated the entity's imprisonment. The perspective shift continued expanding, revealing centuries of maintenance and renewal, different groups assuming responsibility as knowledge transferred imperfectly between generations. Native populations had maintained distance through cultural prohibitions before European settlers arrived. Religious orders subsequently integrated the site into their cosmological frameworks while preserving essential containment functions. Park establishment had complicated matters by simultaneously protecting the location from development while increasing potential for accidental discovery. Ranger services assumed monitoring responsibility, developing protocols for regular inspection while discouraging visitor access through deliberate omission from official maps and records. Throughout these transitions, the entity beneath remained constant, patient, aware, opportunistically testing barriers through psychological connection with receptive individuals, not malevolent in human terms, but fundamentally incompatible with human understanding, operating according to principles and purposes beyond conventional comprehension. The dream concluded with sudden perspective reversion, awareness contracting from expansive historical knowledge back to individual viewpoint. I stood again before the partially chained trapdoor, now understanding its significance within larger patterns of containment and persistence. The entity had existed before human presence in the region and would likely continue long after human departure, its time frame rendering our interventions temporary, regardless of perceived permanence. Woke with unsettling clarity rather than typical dream confusion, insights from the expanded perspective remaining accessible to conscious consideration. For the first time, I recognized our experience not as isolated incident, but continuation of established pattern. Two more individuals among countless others who had encountered the Keeper's Chapel throughout its existence, momentarily connected to something ancient before returning to ordinary life. This reframing brought neither comfort nor resolution, but a different relationship with persistent dreams and occasional intrusive thoughts. The connection wasn't personal but circumstantial, proximity creating temporary bridges between fundamentally different existences. The entity reached outward not from malice but from nature, following patterns established long before human understanding attempted categorization or containment. Jack and I continue our friendship, our shared experience providing unique perspective that neither fully discusses with others. He appears genuinely free from lasting connection, while I maintain functional coexistence with persistent but manageable influence. We never return to Algonquin, tacitly avoiding wilderness adventures that might trigger renewed vulnerability. The Keeper's Chapel stands somewhere in that vast forest expanse, weathered walls containing ancient mystery, behind partially compromised chains. Rangers or their institutional descendants presumably continue monitoring and maintenance, extending centuries-old containment through systems and knowledge increasingly divorced from original understanding. Occasionally, I contemplate reporting my ongoing dreams to authorities, providing warning about potential vulnerability in existing protections. Each time practical considerations intervene, who exactly would receive such information? What credibility would accompany reports based on subjective experience rather than verifiable observation? How would new knowledge differ meaningfully from protections already in place? Instead, I maintain personal distance, both geographical and psychological, from that isolated structure and its underground secret. The dreams continue with stubborn regularity, neither intensifying nor diminishing as years pass. I've accepted them as permanent consequence of brief proximity to something beyond conventional understanding, a persistent shadow from encounter with the inexplicable. What lies beneath that trapdoor remains contained for now, secured behind ancient chains and forgotten religious symbols in a structure absent from official maps. Whether this containment represents appropriate response or merely delayed confrontation remains unanswerable without fuller comprehension of what exactly waits in darkness beneath weathered floorboards. The church exists somewhere in Algonquin's vast wilderness, standing silent among ancient trees while seasons pass without notice. And whatever remains chained beneath that rusted trapdoor continues its patient existence, occasionally reaching outward through dreams and whispered thoughts, waiting for chains to weaken or barriers to fail or understanding to finally bridge fundamental differences between its reality and our own. I sincerely hope it waits forever. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I've never experienced such profound terror in my life. To this day, I still don't know who this man was, what he was trying to accomplish, or if he remains where I last saw him. I apologize for the extensive geographical description that follows, but I need you to understand how isolated I was when this incident occurred, and how catastrophically it could have ended if not for my parents' intervention. It was June 2023. And I had returned home for summer break for the first time in a year after beginning university. At 19, I was eager to reconnect with the landscape of my childhood. Our residence was situated just beyond the borders of a small, close-knit town, completely encircled by dense forest. The property featured a modest man-made lake that branched off from a substantial river, snaking for miles through the woodland, eventually splitting into several streams east of the lake. Adjacent to our home ran a narrow, grassy trail that led to the river by following one of these streams. Though it required substantial walking, approximately 3 hours round trip, it was a journey I had frequently undertaken throughout my youth. The surrounding vegetation had grown increasingly wild and untamed over the years, with thorny underbrush and fallen trees creating natural barriers that deterred casual hikers. This remoteness had always been part of its appeal to me. The pristine solitude, the untouched quality that made it feel like my personal sanctuary. The forest possessed a certain ambiance I'd never found elsewhere. During summer, sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with the breeze. In the absence of human activity, wildlife thrived undisturbed. Deer, foxes, badgers, and countless bird species. I had documented most of these encounters in journals throughout my childhood, cataloging the natural world with scientific precision inherited from my biologist father. This particular forest covered over 30 square miles of uninterrupted wilderness, broken only by the occasional stream or clearing. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away from our property, and the closest emergency services were stationed in town, approximately 15 minutes by car, assuming optimal conditions. These details seemed inconsequential until they suddenly weren't. I knew this forest thoroughly. I understood where I could navigate through dense tree clusters to access the stream. The established trail would gradually veer northwest, moving away from the waterway before making an abrupt westward turn several miles into the journey. By this point, the stream would be concealed deep within the forest. My routine involved continuing north, following the stream through the woodland to reach the river, then tracking the river westward to arrive at the lake. Disorientation comes easily in these woods because the terrain doesn't simply decline toward water sources. It undulates continuously, rising and falling without discernible pattern, until you find yourself completely enveloped by trees with no clear directional markers. I had spent countless days exploring these grounds, either alone or with my father over 18 years, without ever encountering another person in the forest. My first excursion that summer occurred on a Tuesday morning. I departed early, walking along the established path away from the stream until reaching the sharp bend, then re-entering the forest. After approximately an hour of hiking, I reached the stream. The water ran clear that day, reflecting the cloudless sky above. As I knelt to cool my hands in the water, a sound pierced the natural ambiance, a bell ringing in the distance, coming from the north. The ringing was fervent and oddly rhythmic, not random as one might expect from an animal accidentally triggering it. I listened intently, initially wondering if it might be a hunting dog that had wandered from its owner. The forest amplified sounds in unpredictable ways, making distance difficult to gauge, but this seemed distinctly intentional. Despite recognizing the potential danger, I began moving toward the sound. In retrospect, my behavior was recklessly typical of horror story victims, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. As I moved, the bell continued its eerie cadence, but its source seemed to recede. After approximately 5 minutes of pursuit, the ringing ceased entirely. I paused, attempting to process what I'd heard. The stream lacked sufficient flow to transport an object producing such a clear, resonant tone. The river remained too distant to be the source. I contemplated numerous explanations, but my instinct suggested human activity, a conclusion that generated inexplicable discomfort. I attempted to dismiss these thoughts and continue my walk normally. The forest had returned to its typical sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, distant water flowing, when I discovered something profoundly disturbing. A badger dead and meticulously decapitated. The precision of the wound indicated it had been executed with a sharp implement, likely a hunting knife. The carcass remained relatively fresh. The body maintained flexibility without significant decomposition odor. However, the wound already hosted clusters of maggots, suggesting it had been there for at least several hours. The realization struck me forcefully. The bell sound had followed the stream's path, as had I. Logically, the badger had been placed, perhaps even killed at this location deliberately. I observed the surroundings more carefully now, noting disturbed undergrowth and what appeared to be partial footprints in softer ground. Something about the methodical nature of the decapitation disturbed me far more than finding a natural animal death. The precision spoke of patience, of time spent ensuring the cut was perfect. I photographed the scene with my phone, intending to show my father, then continued my hike with considerably more vigilance. Nothing else unusual occurred that day. I completed my circuit to the lake and returned home, mentioning the strange bell and decapitated badger to my parents over dinner. My father, an experienced outdoorsman, suggested it might be another hiker playing a prank or perhaps evidence of poachers operating in the area. He promised to notify the local conservation officer. That night I reviewed my photos, zooming in on the clean-edged wound of the badger. Something about the calculated nature of it prevented me from dismissing it as a simple act of cruelty or hunting. The following days passed uneventfully. I occupied myself with summer reading assignments and reconnecting with hometown friends. However, thoughts of the forest incident recurred frequently. I researched local wildlife patterns and consulted my father's extensive nature books, searching for explanations. Could territorial animals decapitate prey so precisely? Was there any record of similar incidents in the area? Nothing I discovered provided satisfactory answers. The conservation officer visited our property 3 days after my hike. He reviewed my photographs and took notes, but seemed skeptical about finding anyone responsible. "These woods are vast," he explained. "Unless someone's operating regularly in a specific area, finding them would be nearly impossible." He promised increased patrols near established trails, but acknowledged the limitations of monitoring such extensive wilderness. During this period, I experienced disturbing dreams, visions of walking endless forest paths while bell sounds echoed from every direction. I'd wake disoriented, convinced someone was observing me from beyond my bedroom window. Rational thought eventually prevailed with daylight, but the lingering unease remained. Something about the incident had fundamentally altered my perception of the forest I'd previously considered a sanctuary. My father suggested we avoid that particular forest section for the remainder of summer. Plenty of other trails to explore, he reasoned. No sense putting ourselves in potential danger. I agreed verbally, but internally questioned whether avoiding the area would resolve my growing unease. Part of me, the reckless, curious part, wanted answers that could only be found by returning. A week passed. The conservation officer reported finding nothing unusual during his patrols. Local hiking groups hadn't reported strange encounters. The incident began fading from immediate concern, relegated to an unusual but isolated event. Perhaps it truly had been a one-time occurrence, a hiker with bizarre habits or a poacher avoiding detection. Logic suggested avoiding further investigation. However, logic rarely dictates human behavior when curiosity intervenes. 1 week after my initial forest encounter, I made the fateful decision to return. My rationale contained multiple flaws. I convinced myself that daylight exploration posed minimal risk, that my familiarity with the terrain provided adequate protection, that the previous incident was likely isolated. These justifications masked my fundamental motivation. I needed to confirm whether the disturbance had been anomalous or indicated a persistent threat. I departed home at approximately 6 p.m., significantly later than my previous excursion. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating alternating patterns of illumination and darkness across the forest floor. My backpack contained essential supplies: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a substantial flashlight, preparedness that ultimately proved insufficient. The weather forecast had predicted scattered showers, but dark clouds gathering overhead suggested more substantial precipitation approaching. I considered postponing, but calculated that I could complete at least part of my intended circuit before rainfall intensified. The humidity hung heavily in the air, creating that distinctive pre-storm atmosphere that amplifies every natural scent. I retraced my previous route, walking along the established path before diverting toward the stream. The forest appeared unchanged. Identical trees, familiar undergrowth, consistent birdsong gradually diminishing as wildlife sensed the impending storm. I reached the stream location where I'd previously discovered the badger carcass. No evidence remained. Scavengers had likely removed any traces. This observation provided temporary relief. I continued toward the river, reaching it within approximately an hour. The water level had risen slightly from recent rainfall, creating subtle whirlpools where it navigated around submerged rocks and branches. Standing at the riverbank, I suddenly questioned the wisdom of my expedition. The darkening sky and increasing wind suggested the approaching storm would arrive sooner than anticipated. Additionally, sunset would occur around 9 p.m., leaving me potentially navigating unfamiliar terrain in darkness. Making what I believed was the prudent decision, I turned back, intending to retrace my steps to the stream and then follow the most direct route home. The first raindrops began falling as I re-entered the densest section of forest. What began as gentle precipitation rapidly intensified into a substantial downpour. Water cascaded through the canopy, creating a continuous curtain that limited visibility and transformed the forest floor into increasingly treacherous terrain. The sound of rainfall against countless leaves created an encompassing wall of white noise that masked more subtle forest sounds. I walked with increasing speed, head lowered against the deluge, navigating primarily by memory through the most open sections of forest. My focused downward gaze prevented me from noticing the obstruction until physical contact occurred. The impact wasn't particularly forceful, but the immediate sensation registered as wrong, too solid for foliage yet yielding in a distinctly organic manner. The accompanying odor confirmed my worst fears before visual identification was possible. An overwhelming scent of putrefaction assaulted my senses, the unmistakable stench of advanced decomposition. I raised my gaze to confront a nightmarish tableau. The decapitated badger carcass I'd discovered previously now hung suspended from a tree branch. The head had been reattached to the body through a grotesque approximation of taxidermy, secured to the front paws with what appeared to be fishing line, creating a macabre puppet-like presentation. The entire construction swung gently in the wind, dripping a viscous greenish fluid that had partially transferred to my clothing during our collision. My physiological response was immediate and overwhelming. Violent gagging preceded dry heaving as my body attempted to purge itself in response to the sensory assault. The putrid liquid clung to my hair and face, mingling with rainwater in revolting rivulets. I frantically wiped at my skin and clothing, desperate to remove any trace of contact with the decaying matter. Initial shock gave way to horrifying realization. I had walked this exact route to reach the river, meaning the badger's remains must have been suspended after I had passed this location. Someone had been tracking my movements through the forest with sufficient proximity to anticipate my return path. The implication was undeniable. I was being observed, possibly stalked. Every unexplained sound from my journey suddenly acquired sinister significance. The subtle cracking of branches I'd attributed to wildlife movement might have been human footsteps. The occasional rustling beyond visual range could have indicated someone paralleling my path while maintaining concealment. My isolation, previously a source of comfort, transformed instantly into vulnerability. I surveyed my surroundings with new urgency, attempting to identify any sign of human presence through the continuous rainfall. The forest had become an environment of concealment, with potential observation points hidden behind every substantial tree trunk or dense vegetation cluster. Paranoia escalated rapidly as I considered how long this surveillance might have been occurring. Making a swift decision, I abandoned my planned route along the stream and began moving directly toward the established path. This alternate direction would extend my journey, but would eventually connect with the more trafficked trail where my father could potentially locate me. I accelerated to a jog despite the hazardous conditions, prioritizing distance over caution. The rainfall continued unabated, transforming the forest floor into increasingly treacherous terrain. My boots sank into softening soil with each step, occasionally sliding on exposed roots or concealed stones. Despite these challenges, I maintained my expedited pace, driven by escalating fear and the desperate need to reach more accessible territory. Then it returned, the distinctive sound that had initiated this nightmare. A bell rang through the rainfall, its tone unmistakably similar to what I'd heard during my previous visit. Unlike before, the ringing persisted with deliberate rhythm, neither approaching nor receding but maintaining consistent volume. This stability suggested the source remained stationary, perhaps intentionally signaling its presence. In that moment, rationality temporarily abandoned me. I fumbled for my phone with rain-slicked fingers, miraculously maintaining grip long enough to call my father. The connection established, I desperately explained my situation while continuing to move. I needed immediate evacuation from the forest. Someone was present and likely stalking me. I was heading toward the path's western bend where it sharply turned. My father, recognizing genuine terror in my voice, immediately departed with my mother to meet me at the designated location. The bell continued its eerie cadence, occasionally pausing before resuming with altered rhythm. The sound seemed to shift position subtly, first ahead, then behind, then to my right, creating the disturbing impression of encirclement. My auditory processing became increasingly unreliable as panic escalated, compounded by the rainfall's persistent white noise and my own labored breathing. My ability to maintain directional awareness deteriorated rapidly. The southwestern trajectory I'd intended to follow became increasingly uncertain as familiar landmarks disappeared in the growing darkness and relentless precipitation. My pace alternated between frantic running and hurried walking as exhaustion competed with adrenaline. Each pause to recalibrate direction was accompanied by hypervigilant scanning of surrounding vegetation for movement. I maintained phone contact with my mother, who relayed their progress toward the meeting point. Their presence on the established path provided a lifeline, a specific destination and the promise of safety. I continued moving through the forest, repeatedly attempting to regulate my breathing enough to listen for sounds beyond my own movements and the persistent rainfall. Branches snapped somewhere behind me. The sound was distinctive, carrying the unmistakable quality of deliberate movement rather than natural breakage from wind or water weight. The bell rang again, closer, more insistent. I increased my pace to full running despite the hazardous conditions, no longer concerned with injury risk from falls compared to the greater threat at my back. Complete darkness enveloped the forest now, my world reduced to the narrow cone of visibility provided by my flashlight. The rain had partially subsided, but water continued dripping from saturated foliage, creating phantom sounds that triggered repeated startled responses. My progress had become a desperate stumbling advance, each step threatening to end in a fall on the slippery terrain. The bell rang again, noticeably closer. I risked a glance backward, sweeping my flashlight in a broad arc behind me. The beam caught nothing initially, then illuminated a partial view at the clearing's edge that fundamentally altered my understanding of my situation. A tall figure stood motionless at the forest periphery. Distance and darkness prevented detailed observation, but certain elements registered with terrifying clarity. The individual's height exceeded normal proportions, though whether this resulted from actual stature or artificial extension remained unclear. More significantly, both hands manipulated a large brass bell positioned at waist level, deliberately creating the sound that had haunted my forest experiences. The figure made no attempt to conceal its presence now. It remained stationary, allowing full observation while continuing to ring the bell with methodical precision. Though facial features remained indiscernible, I perceived with absolute certainty that the figure maintained direct eye contact during this brief connection. An unspoken message transmitted across the separation, acknowledgement that the game of observation had progressed to direct confrontation. This visual confirmation catalyzed previously untapped physical resources. I abandoned all pretense of measured movement and launched into genuine flight. My legs propelled me forward with unprecedented speed, Fueled by primal survival instinct rather than conscious direction, I screamed continuously, partly to attract potential rescuers, partly as involuntary vocalization of absolute terror, and partly as psychological defense against the sounds potentially emanating from behind. "I'm on the phone with the police right now," I shouted into the darkness. "They're waiting on the path. They know where I am." The deception was instinctive, an attempt to deter pursuit by suggesting imminent intervention. In reality, my connection remained exclusively with my parents, who continued advancing toward our rendezvous point. I desperately wanted to call out directly to my father, to beg for immediate rescue, but strategic thinking prevailed through the panic. Revealing my exact position and vulnerability might accelerate whatever intentions the pursuer harbored. Instead, I maintained forward momentum while periodically glancing backward, expecting to see the figure directly behind me with each turn. My physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen deprivation created lightheadedness that threatened consciousness. My throat burned from continued screaming and gasping. Muscles approached complete failure after sustained maximum exertion. Even terror has physiological limitations. The body cannot maintain emergency response indefinitely without consequence. I became vaguely aware that my backpack was no longer present, apparently lost during the frantic flight without conscious recognition of its absence. My phone remained clutched in a death grip, the connection to potential salvation too precious to relinquish, despite the encumbrance to efficient movement. Time perception distorted completely. What objectively lasted perhaps 15 minutes expanded subjectively into an eternal nightmare of perpetual flight, without progress. The forest seemed determined to prevent escape, presenting endless identical landscapes regardless of distance covered. My awareness narrowed to fundamental survival priorities: maintain direction, maximize speed, preserve consciousness. Then sudden auditory salvation pierced the darkness, my father's voice calling my name with unmistakable urgency. The sound originated ahead and slightly left of my current trajectory, providing crucial navigational correction. I altered course immediately, abandoning any remaining caution in favor of direct approach to the voice's source. "Dad," I screamed, my voice barely functional after sustained abuse. "I'm here." "He's behind me." The admission of pursuit escaped without strategic consideration, raw truth emerging from overwhelming fear. My father continued calling, the changing intonation confirming visual contact had been established. His voice contained the distinctive quality of someone observing distress while closing distance to intervene. When we finally connected physically, I collapsed against him with complete abandonment of remaining strength. My legs buckled instantly. Functioning ceased the moment safety appeared attainable. "The bell," I gasped between desperate breathing attempts. "Did you hear it? There's someone following me." My father confirmed auditory detection of the bell both directly and through my mother's phone connection during my flight. This validation provided crucial psychological reinforcement. The experience wasn't hallucination or panic-induced misperception, but objectively verifiable threat. Supporting most of my weight, my father expedited our movement toward the waiting vehicle, where my mother maintained engine running and doors unlocked in preparation for immediate departure. The final distance to established path and subsequent vehicle transfer remains absent from memory, a period lost to trauma-induced dissociation. Our departure from the area occurred with maximum urgency. My mother navigated the rural roads with uncharacteristic speed while my father maintained vigilant observation through rear windows for pursuit. During this journey, I provided fragmented description of the encountered figure between continuing attempts to normalize respiratory function. Upon reaching home, security protocols were implemented, doors locked, authorities contacted, neighbors alerted to potential forest presence. The police response remained frustratingly standardized despite the evident terror we displayed. Without specific threat, assault, or identified individual, their capacity for intervention remained limited. They promised increased patrols and took detailed statements, but operational reality constrained meaningful action. In subsequent days, conservation officers and local police conducted limited forest exploration, focused around our described locations. Nothing conclusive emerged beyond confirmation that something unusual had occurred. Disturbed vegetation, consistent with frantic movement, a recovered backpack containing my abandoned belongings, and most significantly, remnants of crude twine and animal tissue at the location where I described the suspended badger carcass. I never returned to that forest. The experience permanently altered my relationship with natural environments, transforming previously comforting isolation into potential vulnerability. Nightmares persisted for months afterward, featuring variations of pursuit through endless trees while bell sounds provided countdown to inevitable capture. To this day, I cannot definitively explain what occurred during those summer forest visits. The most rational explanation suggests a disturbed individual establishing territory and responding to perceived intrusion. Alternative theories proposed by investigators included illegal hunting operations protecting discovery, territorial transience, or even elaborate harassment from unknown individuals with undetermined motivation. Whatever the explanation, the primal fear experienced during those moments permanently altered my perception of safety in familiar environments. The watcher in the woods remains unidentified, their purpose unknown, their current location uncertain. Only one conclusion emerges with absolute certainty. The most terrifying threat is not supernatural predation, but calculated human malevolence operating beyond society's protective boundaries. I'd been slumped in my squeaky office chair, counting the minutes until the midday heat lost its grip, when the radio crackled on the desk. One of our volunteers' voices trembled on the other end, asking for immediate backup. They'd spotted smoke rising from somewhere near the far boundary of our little desert park. Normally, suspicious plumes of smoke meant yet another junker set ablaze, something we saw often enough that it barely rattled me anymore. But the quiver in the volunteer's tone gnawed at me. Something about this situation felt off. Without waiting for protocol or double-checking any sign-out sheets, I grabbed my keys and waved my coworker, Manny, over. We piled into our dusty truck and took off down the barren road. Nothing but a shimmer of heat on the horizon. My mind kept replaying worst-case scenarios, a wildfire blazing out of control, folks trapped in a gutted vehicle, or maybe something darker I couldn't fully process yet. The desert seemed too quiet as we sped toward the site. Normally, I'd catch glimpses of desert hares scuttling across the road, or a hawk circling overhead. Not this time. The entire place felt as if it was bracing for bad news. Manny fiddled with the radio, trying to reach the volunteers again. But all we got was static laced with muffled crackles. Each burst of static made me grip the steering wheel tighter. The road stretched ahead like a scar across the landscape, and with each mile marker we passed, the dread in my stomach intensified. 6 years I'd been a ranger at Sandstone National Park, and I'd seen plenty of disturbing things. Hikers with heat-stroke babbling nonsense, drug deals gone bad, even a murder-suicide at one of the lookout points. But something in that volunteer's voice triggered an alarm deep in my subconscious. "Try them again," I told Manny, my voice sounding hollow in the cab. He adjusted the frequency. "Volunteer unit, this is Ranger Station. Come in." Nothing but static. I pressed harder on the accelerator, sending a cloud of dust billowing behind us. The truck's engine whined in protest as we climbed a steep incline. From the top of the rise, we could see the eastern boundary of the park. And there it was, a thick column of smoke rising from behind a cluster of rock formations, black against the cloudless blue sky. "That's not a campfire," Manny muttered. "Too much smoke." I nodded grimly. The smoke was oily and dense, the kind that comes from synthetic materials burning, plastic, rubber, upholstery. Vehicle fire, no doubt about it, but the location made no sense. That section of the park had no road access. You'd have to drive off trail for at least 2 miles of rough terrain to reach it. We rounded a bend and spotted thick smoke curling into the sky. That acrid scent of burned rubber and metal practically tore through the truck's ventilation. We pulled up, tires crunching on gravel, and the volunteers waved us over, their faces drained of color. I stepped out and got an immediate taste of heat so intense it felt like a furnace blast. The car in question was more of a scorched metal skeleton at this point, the flames mostly dying down but leaving behind angry black fumes. Manny and I exchanged uneasy glances. We'd dealt with torched vehicles before. Thieves often dumped them after stripping out valuable parts. But as we edged closer, something caught my eye through the shattered driver's side window. It looked like a large lump leaning against the steering wheel. I tried convincing myself it was just a mass of melted upholstery. Stepping around for a clearer look, I discovered it was definitely not just a ruined seat. My stomach dropped. I found myself staring at the remains of a person, the body blackened and distorted, features impossible to make out. The door handle had melted in places and the rope, yes, rope, had fused to the metal. This wasn't a simple joyride gone wrong. Someone had brought this car here, bound the person inside and shot them before setting the entire thing aflame. The sight pressed down on me, suffocating, like the desert itself was turning hostile. Manny rushed back to the truck to call for proper backup. As we stood by, the smoke coiled in the sky, trailing a pungent odor that clung to my clothes. Time seemed to grind to a halt while we waited. One of the volunteers hovered near me, stammering about how they'd initially assumed the car was just another stolen husk until they peered into the driver's seat. I remember scanning the area, paranoid about a possible suspect lurking in the brush, maybe watching us from behind a tumbleweed. The fire department eventually roared in, dousing the smoldering wreck, sending up fresh plumes of steam. Then the police arrived, setting up a perimeter with that familiar yellow tape. I tried to focus on small details like half-burned food wrappers on the ground and the bullet holes scarring the frame. How many shots were fired? Was the victim alive when they were bound? I hated how my own thoughts drifted into morbid territory. The volunteer who'd made the discovery, a retired schoolteacher named James, sat on a rock nearby, his face ashen. I walked over and offered him my canteen. "First time seeing something like this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded, his hands shaking as he took a sip of water. 28 years teaching high school biology. Dissected frogs, pigs, even a human cadaver once at a workshop. But this, his voice trailed off, I understood. There's something profoundly different about encountering death in its violent, unnatural state. The human brain isn't wired to process it easily. I'd seen enough over the years to build some emotional calluses, but even I felt nauseated. The sheriff arrived, his SUV kicking up dust as it braked hard. He was a stocky man with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. I knew him, Sheriff Reeves. We'd worked together on various incidents over the years. "What have we got?" he asked, pulling on latex gloves. I briefed him on what we'd found, keeping my voice steady through practiced professionalism. But inside my mind was racing, imagining scenarios. Who was the victim? Why bring them all the way out here? The desert held many secrets, but this one seemed particularly dark. As investigators combed the scene, I noticed something glinting in the sand about 20 feet from the car. I pointed it out to one of the crime scene techs, who carefully dug it up, a shell casing. Then another, and another, 5 in total, forming a rough semicircle. "Execution style," the tech murmured, bagging the casings, but I could count at least 7 entry points in the vehicle's frame. Some shots had missed. The victim had struggled. I turned away, swallowing hard against the bile rising in my throat. Hours slipped by as investigators combed through the ashes, taking pictures, bagging up scraps of rope. I noticed Manny in a corner staring silently at the wreck. He'd told me once that he was used to gore from a past job, but even he looked shaken. What we found here wasn't just violence, it was cruelty. Eventually the site was labeled secure, and the authorities sent us on our way. We left behind a few sheriff's deputies to maintain the perimeter until forensics could finish up. As Manny and I drove back, the sky had bled into a deep sun-scorched orange. My head swam with everything we'd witnessed. The volunteers, wide-eyed and jittery, followed in their own car, still reeling from the realization that the scene they'd stumbled upon was so much worse than they'd feared. By the time we reached the station, a rumor was already circulating about the haunted site. Word travels fast in small circles, and folks around here can't resist a good ghost story. I overheard someone joking about how it had probably become the park's most sought-after camping spot. Visitors love a grim legend, but there was nothing amusing in the images still stuck in my head. The scorched seat, the twisted rope, that unrecognizable form in the driver's seat. Back at the ranger station, I had to file an incident report. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, struggling to find clinical language for what we'd discovered. How do you describe the way charred human remains look without the words sounding either too detached or too graphic? I settled for the bare minimum of detail required, focusing instead on the logistics, time of discovery, personnel involved, actions taken. The phone rang constantly. News outlets catching wind of the story, local residents concerned about safety, park administrators demanding updates. I fielded the calls mechanically, my mind still out there in the desert with that ghastly scene. Sheriff Reeves stopped by around sunset looking tired. "Any ID on the victim?" I asked. He shook his head. "Vehicle was reported stolen 3 days ago from a mall parking lot in Henderson. As for the body," he paused, choosing his words, "dental records might help, but it'll take time. Fire did a number on the remains. Any theories?" "Several, none good." He rubbed his eyes. "Drug deal, maybe. Cartel hit. Or something personal. The effort to transport the victim all the way out here suggests whoever did this wanted privacy and time." The thought made my skin crawl. Someone had meticulously planned this murder, selected our remote corner of the desert as their execution ground. Had they been watching the park? Studying our patrol schedules? Did they know about the blind spots in our surveillance? "We'll be increasing patrols," I told him, "and warning visitors." "Good." He handed me his card. "Call if anything else comes up." Anything at all. These kinds of killers sometimes return to the scene. Those words echoed in my head long after he left. Return to the scene. I imagined a shadowy figure lurking among the rocks, watching us process their handiwork, perhaps even now planning their next move. I tried distracting myself with trivial tasks, sorting gear, scribbling meaningless notes on my next shift's to-do list. Nothing helped. Deep down, I knew I wouldn't forget what I saw that day. The desert had always been harsh, but I'd never thought it could be so merciless. And we still had no clue who that poor person was or why they ended up on that lonely stretch of sand. That night, insomnia took hold. All I could do was stare at the ceiling, replaying the stench of scorched metal and flesh, the hush of onlookers too rattled to speak. My mind refused to drift anywhere else. Instead, it clung to the notion that something or someone was out there, ready to do it again if they felt like it. For the first time since I started this job, the wide-open desert didn't look like a place of freedom. It felt like a place you go to bury your secrets, the kind that should never see daylight. For 3 days following the discovery, I moved through my duties like a ghost. The burned car scene dominated the local news. Speculation ran wild. Drug cartels, human trafficking, organized crime. The truth was, we had no answers, just questions that multiplied with each passing hour. The victim remained unidentified. Male, according to the preliminary autopsy, between 30 and 40 years old. No matches in the missing persons database so far. A phantom burned beyond recognition with no name to grant him dignity even in death. My apartment felt suffocating. Each night I'd lie awake, the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead, casting elongated shadows that seemed to reach for me like grasping fingers. I'd jolt upright at every creak in the floorboards, every rustling branch against my window. Even with my service weapon in the nightstand drawer, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Work offered no refuge. The atmosphere at the station had changed. Rangers who once joked easily with each other now spoke in hushed tones. Volunteers called in sick rather than patrol the outer boundaries. Everyone felt it, the violation of our sanctuary. The desert had always harbored dangers. Heat stroke, flash floods, venomous creatures. But these were natural hazards we understood and respected. This human evil was something else entirely. On the 4th day, I was scheduled to patrol the eastern sector, including the area near where we'd found the car. I nearly called in sick. The thought of returning made my chest tighten. But something deeper than fear pushed me to go. Perhaps the stubborn belief that surrendering my territory to dread would only give power to whoever had committed that atrocity. The morning was unseasonably cool as I drove out. The horizon painted in soft pinks and golds. Beauty amid horror, the desert's constant contradiction. I stopped at several lookout points, scanning the landscape with binoculars, noting wildlife movements, checking for signs of illegal camping or off-trail driving. Everything seemed normal until I approached the site. Yellow police tape still cordoned off the area, fluttering in the breeze. The burned car was gone, hauled away for further forensic examination, but a large black stain marked where it had stood. Carbon, ash, and oil had soaked into the sand, creating a scar that would likely remain visible for years. I parked a respectful distance away and approached on foot. The wind had shifted the sand, partially covering some of the investigators' footprints, but the area still bore witness to the frantic activity of that day. Evidence markers had been removed, but I could see where they'd been placed, small depressions in the sand marking where shell casings had been recovered. Standing there, I tried to reconstruct the scene in my mind. The killer, or killers, bringing their bound victim to this isolated spot. The terror the victim must have felt, realizing what was about to happen. Had they begged? Bargained? Or had they faced death with quiet dignity, knowing there was no escape? A sound behind me, the soft crunch of footsteps on sand, made me whirl around, hand instinctively moving to my sidearm. But it was only a desert tortoise, its ancient shell blending with the rocky terrain, moving with surprising speed toward a patch of scrub brush. I exhaled slowly, embarrassed by my jumpiness, yet unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I was still reeling from the scorched car and the horrifying discoveries tied to it when we got another call that sent the station into a near panic. Our supervisor, usually the picture of calm, was on the phone, voice tight. A man on the line threatened to end everything, claimed he had a stash of guns. He spat out coordinates that placed him right on the fringe of our territory. I remember standing in the office, radio in hand, waiting to be dispatched, my mind already leaping to dreadful scenarios. Was I about to come across another scene as horrific as that burned-out husk? The cubicle farm chief tried to keep the man on the line, but he was raving about regret. About how he had nowhere else to go, that he wanted the desert to swallow him up. My coworker Ricardo and I exchanged glances. We both knew we were going out there. Protocol demanded it. No matter how unqualified we felt for a crisis involving a potentially armed individual. We piled into the same dusty truck I'd driven to the charred vehicle days earlier. The sun was glaring overhead and everything in the desert looked bleached, barren. Ricardo fiddled with the radio, trying to get more updates, but the chatter was fragmented. We heard that another ranger outfit had arrived first, so we sped up, hoping they'd managed to talk the man down. A pit in my stomach warned me the outcome might be far from ideal. As we approached the coordinates, we spotted a couple of trucks from that other agency, parked at a crooked angle. One of their rangers stood by, raising a hand in a universal signal that basically said, "Keep your distance." We eased off the gas and rolled to a stop. I could feel a wave of dread pulsing from the group in front of us. I hopped out, scanning the desert for any sign of movement. The other agency's ranger, a woman who looked like she'd barely slept, walked over. Her expression was a mask of grief, as though she'd lived through this nightmare before. She whispered that the man we were looking for had followed through with his threat, but hadn't perished instantly. He'd shot himself, then staggered a ways, leaving behind a heartbreaking trail of blood until he finally collapsed. That knowledge hit me like a weight on my chest. While Ricardo stayed back with the truck, I inched forward to where the sand turned darker. Another ranger was kneeling there, shaking his head, radio in hand. I couldn't see the man's body directly. It was behind some rocks, but the hush from everyone present told me I didn't want to. It made me think of the new ranger standing off to the side, hugging her own arms. Word around the station was that she'd lost her husband, a fellow ranger, to the same fate not long ago. And here she was, face to face with another self-inflicted tragedy. The parallels must have cut her deeper than words could describe. Ricardo came up behind me, asked if we should offer help, do anything at all. The other outfit's lead ranger shook her head. She said they had it under control, though her tired eyes suggested otherwise. They told us to leave so we wouldn't be buried in endless paperwork. Officially, it was a matter for local law enforcement to finalize. We lingered, unsure of our place. Ultimately, we retreated back to our truck, guilt and sadness trailing behind us. Driving away felt surreal. The interior of the truck was baking from the sun, but I was shivering inside, grappling with the idea that these desert parks I once loved had turned into a stage for human despair. The further we got from that scene, the more the day's bright sky turned into a punishing glare, as if the desert itself was tired of witnessing such sorrow. I couldn't stop thinking about that blood trail. How far had the man staggered before collapsing? What thoughts had gone through his mind in those final moments? Regret, perhaps? A desperate wish to undo what couldn't be undone? "You okay?" Ricardo asked as we drove back, his voice cutting through my dark reverie. I nodded automatically, but the truth was far from it. 2 deaths in our jurisdiction within a week. One a brutal murder, the other a suicide. Both violent ends in the vast emptiness of the desert. Both scenes that would be forever imprinted in my memory. Think there's a connection? Ricardo voiced the question hovering in my thoughts. Between the suicide and the murder? Doubtful, I replied, but uncertainty gnawed at me. The timing seemed too coincidental. Two desperate acts in such proximity. Maybe, Ricardo persisted, the suicide guy knew something about the murder. Maybe he was involved and couldn't live with it. Pure speculation, I said, but the theory planted itself in my mind. What if he was right? What if the man who took his own life had been part of whatever happened at that burned car? A witness? An accomplice consumed by guilt? Back at the station, the combination of the burned car and the terrible discovery weighed on the mood. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the grimness. I heard hushed conversations in the hall, people whispering about how the desert had always attracted wanderers, how some folks came here for a spiritual rebirth, while others sought an escape. Unable to take the tension, I decided to do something drastic. After my shift, I drove out to one of our closed parks for some midnight stargazing. I figured maybe solitude and a sky full of meteors could help me remember the desert's beauty, give me a reason to breathe easier. And for some odd reason, I packed my banjo. I'm no musician, but strumming a few off-key chords had a calming effect I needed. Under the cover of darkness, I navigated the winding roads leading to a park that had been closed to the public for the off-season. 30 miles of emptiness stretched behind me. Not a single car light in sight. I pulled up to a rusted picnic table near the border of a dried-up wash, the overhead firmament ablaze with more stars than I'd seen in years. I climbed onto the table, banjo resting awkwardly in my lap. Each chord I played sounded tinny in the open space, and a breeze carried the notes away, scattering them across the desert. At first I found a small measure of peace in that rhythm. Plunk, plunk, squeak, a laugh at my own poor skills. Then my imagination flared. Images of charred rope, bullet holes, and that empty-eyed ranger discovering another unspeakable scene. Doubts crowded my head. This place suddenly felt like a proving ground for every dark possibility. I glanced at the horizon, wondering if a stranger with bad intentions lurked out there hidden in the shadows. Memories of the haunted site flickered through my mind. Why had I chosen to be alone yet again, where night could hide anything or anyone? A noise shattered my thoughts. Quick, muffled sounds in the brush accompanied by what almost resembled whispers. My chest felt tight and I paused. Banjo strings still vibrating from the last chord. Something or someone was moving in the darkness, not even trying to be subtle. My eyes struggled to focus, scanning the shrubs for a shape, human, animal, or worse. Those high-pitched murmurs drew nearer, punctuated by rustling leaves. I braced for some twisted confrontation. Maybe it was a group of drifters or local troublemakers who'd come upon me by chance. My pulse hammered, and every nerve wanted me to dash back to the truck. Suddenly, 3 coyotes burst from the undergrowth. They yipped and scampered like they owned the place, giving me barely a passing glance as they streaked by. My heart nearly jumped out of my throat in that moment. A bizarre mix of shock and relief. When their dark silhouettes merged with the distant night, I stood there blinking, banjo clutched in a trembling grip. I couldn't help chuckling at my own paranoia, but a heavier realization sank in. These desert creatures roamed confidently, oblivious to my presence and the nightmares people bring. They weren't weighed down by haunted campsites or heartbreak in the sand. This place was theirs. The moonlight cast everything in silver and shadow, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien. I set the banjo aside and lay back on the picnic table, looking up at the vast dome of stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a ribbon of spilled mercury. Under different circumstances, I would have found it breathtaking. Now it only emphasized how insignificant and vulnerable I was. A speck of consciousness in an indifferent universe. A shooting star streaked across the heavens, its brief brilliance leaving an afterimage on my retinas. I'd always considered such sights good omens, but tonight it seemed more like a warning. Everything burns out eventually. Everything returns to darkness. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it always does in the desert at night. I pulled my jacket tighter, but the chill seemed to seep directly into my bones. Not just from the cold, but from the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed in my relationship with this place. For years, I'd found solace in the desert's vastness, its ancient silences, its harsh beauty. Now those same qualities seemed threatening. The vastness meant nowhere to hide. The silence meant no one would hear a cry for help. The beauty was merely a mask concealing indifference to human suffering. I sat up abruptly, seized by the irrational certainty that I was being watched. The coyotes had long since disappeared, but something else seemed to lurk just beyond the reach of my vision. I scanned the darkness, straining to distinguish natural shapes from potential threats. Was that movement among the distant boulders? A shadow that shifted when it shouldn't have? My hand moved to the sidearm I'd brought with me. Against regulations for off-duty rangers, but a precaution I couldn't forego after what I'd witnessed. The weight of it was reassuring, though I hoped desperately I wouldn't need to use it. "Get a grip," I muttered aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. There's nothing out there, but I couldn't convince myself. Every rustle of wind through the creosote bushes, every distant howl of a coyote, every creak of the cooling earth seemed loaded with menace. The desert that had once been my sanctuary had become a place of dread, and I put the banjo away, the final notes of my attempt at stargazing fading into memory. Driving back, I kept hearing those coyotes in my head, their wild, carefree calls echoing across the dunes, a stark contrast to the human tragedies we'd witnessed. Looking at the vacant road ahead, illuminated by my weak headlights, the desert didn't seem lifeless anymore. It was alive in a raw, indifferent way, capable of hosting scenes of cruelty, sadness, and awe. But the fear clung to me nonetheless, reminding me that while the coyotes found freedom out here, I was the one haunted by what we'd seen. No matter how many shooting stars lit the sky, or how many chords I strummed, I couldn't outrun that uneasy feeling that more trouble could be lurking just beyond the next stretch of desert. The next morning brought news. Sheriff Reeves called me directly, his voice grave but with an undercurrent of excitement that suggested a breakthrough. "We've identified your burn victim," he said without preamble. "Got a hit on the dental records. Name was Anthony Walsh, 37, small-time accountant from Las Vegas with gambling debts. And here's where it gets interesting. He was a bookkeeper for some local businesses, including a couple that we've long suspected of being fronts for money laundering." My pulse quickened. So this was a mob hit? Looks that way. Walsh skimmed some cash, tried to pay down his debts. Wrong move. I processed this, remembering the scorched car, the melted rope, and the suicide? Any connection? A pause on the line. Now that's the real kicker. The suicide victim? William Dunn, 42. Guess what he did for a living? Don't tell me. Another accountant, private investigator, had an office in Henderson, and according to his phone records, Walsh called him 3 times in the week before his death. The pieces clicked together in my mind with sickening clarity. Walsh knew he was in trouble, hired Dunn to help him. That's our working theory. Dunn was looking into whoever Walsh had crossed. Got too close. "And they made him watch what happened to Walsh," I whispered, the horror of it washing over me. "Then let him go, knowing he couldn't live with what he'd seen. Or knowing he'd do their job for them," Reeves said grimly. "Either way, they wanted to send a message. Don't mess with their operation." "Have you identified the businesses Walsh worked for?" "Working on it. But these people are careful. Layers of shell companies, offshore accounts. It'll take time." After we hung up, I sat at my desk trying to wrap my mind around what I'd learned. The desert hadn't randomly been chosen as a dumping ground for unrelated tragedies. It had been deliberately selected as a stage for intimidation and punishment. Our peaceful park had become entangled in something dark and dangerous that stretched far beyond its boundaries. I wondered if it was over. Had the message been sent clearly enough? Or would there be more bodies, more scenes of horror awaiting discovery among the sand and stone? The thought sent a shudder through me. I'd always known that human darkness existed, but somehow I'd convinced myself that the desert's vastness offered a kind of protection, a buffer against the worst aspects of civilization. Now I understood that was an illusion. The desert didn't care. It accepted whatever was offered, beauty or brutality, with the same impassive silence. 2 weeks passed. No new bodies were discovered. No burned cars or trails of blood in the sand. Life at the ranger station gradually returned to something resembling normalcy. The yellow police tape was removed from the crime scenes. Visitors came and went, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had briefly touched this place. But I was changed. Each patrol felt different now. I found myself scanning the horizon not just for stranded hikers or illegal campsites, but for signs of violence, for threats lurking among the cacti and tumbleweeds. My radio was never far from reach. My sidearm always loaded. Sheriff Reeves called periodically with updates. 3 arrests had been made in connection with Walsh's murder. low-level enforcers for a loan shark operation, with ties to larger criminal enterprises. The accountant's stolen files had been recovered, providing evidence of money laundering on a scale that surprised even veteran investigators. The case against the organization was building, though the top figures remained elusive. Small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. At least Walsh's death had meaning now. At least Dunn's final act of despair had contributed to some measure of justice. On my days off, I found myself drawn back to the desert, not to the scene of the crimes, but to other untouched corners of the park. I'd sit among the ancient rocks, watching the light change as the sun traversed the sky, listening to the wind whisper secrets in a language I couldn't quite grasp. Slowly, gradually, I began to make peace with what had happened. The desert hadn't betrayed me. It had simply revealed more of itself than I had been prepared to see. Its beauty and its harshness were two sides of the same coin, inseparable and eternal. One evening, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold, I returned to the picnic table where I'd sat with my banjo that night of terror and revelation. This time I brought no instrument, no false hopes of finding easy comfort in music or starlight. I simply sat in silence, watching as shadows lengthened across the sand, feeling the day's heat radiating upward from the earth. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding thermal currents, its eyes doubtless scanning for the movement of prey among the scattered vegetation. In the distance, a dust devil spun briefly into existence, whirling madly for a few seconds before dissipating as quickly as it had formed. The desert was full of such ephemeral moments, brief dramas that played out whether human eyes witnessed them or not. I thought about Walsh and Dunn, their lives now reduced to case numbers and court proceedings. The desert had absorbed the violence of their ends, as it had absorbed countless other human tragedies throughout its long existence. Yet it remained fundamentally unchanged, neither sanctified nor tainted by what had transpired. And perhaps that was the most terrifying truth of all. Not that evil lurked in these remote places, but that the universe accommodated both beauty and horror, with the same cosmic indifference. The stars would continue to shine. The coyotes would continue to hunt. The wind would continue to sculpt the sand. And humans would continue to bring their best and worst impulses to this unforgiving landscape. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, I made my way back to my truck. The fear hadn't entirely left me, I doubted it ever would, but it had transformed into something more like respect. A clear-eyed acknowledgement of both the desert's wonders and its dangers. The key turned in the ignition, and headlights carved a narrow path through the gathering night. I drove slowly, mindful of the creatures that might cross my path, aware that beyond the reach of my lights, the desert continued infinitely in all directions, harboring secrets I might never fully comprehend. And for now, that incomplete understanding would have to be enough.